The vastness of the Wyoming Territory in the late 1870s did not welcome strangers. It tolerated them, at best, and often it did not even do that. The land was a sprawling, undulating ocean of sagebrush and yellow grass, broken only by the jagged scars of dried riverbeds and the distant, saw-toothed spine of mountains that seemed to retreat further the longer one traveled toward them. Nora Bennett sat inside the swaying, groaning belly of a Concord stagecoach, her spine rigid against the hard leather seat. The air inside the cabin was thick with the smell of old dust, stale tobacco smoke from a previous passenger, and the permeating scent of horse sweat. For 3 weeks, she had been traveling, moving further and further from the soot-stained brick tenements of the East, chasing a horizon that promised nothing but anonymity. She clutched her handbag with both hands, her knuckles white beneath the gray fabric of her gloves. Inside that bag, tucked between a spare handkerchief and a small, leather-bound Bible she rarely opened, was a letter. The paper was creased and soft from being read 100 times. It was an offer of employment, a fragile lifeline thrown across 2,000 miles of wilderness. Mrs. Dawes, Willow Creek School Board. The name sounded stern even in ink. Nora closed her eyes, trying to summon the image of the woman she was supposed to be when she stepped off this coach. A piano teacher, a woman of gentle breeding and quiet tragedy. A widow, perhaps, or simply a spinster devoted to the arts. She was none of those things. The coach hit a rut, a violent jolt that snapped her teeth together and sent a shock of pain up her neck. Nora gasped, but made no sound, her discipline holding firm. She looked at the empty seat across from her. She was the only passenger left. The whiskey salesman had disembarked 2 stops back, and the quiet young cleric had gotten off at the last way station. Now it was just her, the driver shouting profanities at the team of 6 horses outside and the endless, rolling prairie. She looked down at her dress. It was a dark blue serge, practical and modest, bought with the very last of the money she had scraped together. It was a costume, just like the ones she had worn on the small, gas-lit stage of the Gilded Cage. Only this costume covered her from chin to wrist to boot top. You must never let them know, she told herself, the rhythm of the wheels punctuating the thought. You are Nora Bennett, music teacher. You are not the girl who sang for miners and drifters. You are not the girl who let men buy her drinks just to feel the warmth of a human hand. The memory of the saloon brought with it a phantom smell of cheap gin and sawdust. But beneath that lay the darker, sharper memory that had driven her here. Smoke, thick, acrid black smoke. She turned her head to look out the window, trying to outrun the thought. But it was faster than the stagecoach. She saw the tenement hallway back in New York. She heard the crackle of old timber catching fire. She felt the searing heat against her skin and heard the terrified cry of her younger sister. "Clara! Nora! The door is stuck! Nora!" Nora pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass of the coach window, her breath fogging the pain. Clara had been 17. She had been innocent in a way Nora had not been for years. The fire had taken everything. It had taken the few meager possessions they shared. It had taken the roof over their heads. And it had taken Clara. And it had left Nora standing on the cobblestones in her nightdress, soot-stained and screaming, with nothing left in the world but a hollow space in her chest where her heart used to be. The saloon work had come after. It was a desperate necessity born of hunger and the cold reality that a woman alone in the city, without protection, was prey. She had sung. She had smiled. She had dodged wandering hands and swallowed her pride until she had enough coin to buy a ticket west, to a place where no one knew her name and no one knew her shame. The light outside began to change. Nora blinked, pulling herself from the past. The relentless glare of the afternoon sun, which had been beating down on the coach roof for hours, was gone. The sky to the west had turned a bruised, sullen purple. It was not the slow fading of twilight. It was a wall of weather, solid and menacing, bruising the horizon. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the coach doors. Dust devils began to dance alongside the road, swirling columns of grit that slapped against the wood. Above, the driver, A crusty man named Higgins, who had barely spoken 10 words to her since morning, let out a shout. "Hiya, get on there." The coach picked up speed, rocking violently. Nora grabbed the leather strap hanging by the window to steady herself. The temperature dropped, plummeting 20 degrees in the span of 10 minutes. The air grew heavy, charged with the metallic tang of ozone. Then the rain hit. It did not start as a drizzle. It began as a deluge, a sudden, violent assault. Sheets of water slammed into the side of the coach with the force of thrown gravel. The world outside the window vanished, replaced by a gray, churning waterfall. The dust of the road turned instantly to grease, then to soup. The coach slewed sideways. Nora was thrown against the door, her shoulder striking the wood hard. She heard the horses screaming in protest, their hooves scrabbling for purchase in the slick mud. "Whoa! Hold up, you devils!" Higgins screamed, his voice thin and reedy against the roar of the wind. Thunder cracked, a sound like the earth itself splitting open. It was so loud Nora felt it vibrate in her teeth. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape for a heartbeat, a stark, terrifying photograph of white light and black shadows, showing a deep, jagged gully running alongside the road, swelling rapidly with rushing brown water. The coach lurched again, this time sickeningly. The back wheel on the right side caught the edge of a washout. Nora felt the vehicle tip. Gravity seemed to suspend for a second, a breathless pause, and then the world tilted on its axis. With a grinding shriek of wood and iron, the stagecoach slid. Nora scrambled, trying to brace herself, but there was nothing to hold on to. The door on her side, the side now facing the ground, flew open as the latch gave way under the torque. She tumbled out. There was no grace in the fall. She struck the mud hard, rolling down the steep embankment. The cold shocked the air from her lungs. She slid uncontrollably, the heavy surge of her dress catching on rocks and roots, dragging her down into the darkness of the gully. She hit the water with a splash that was immediately swallowed by the roar of the storm. The water was freezing. Runoff from the high peaks mixed with hail and silt. It swirled around her waist, dragging at her heavy skirts, pulling her down. Nora scrambled to her feet, gasping, but the mud bottom was treacherous. She slipped, going under. Darkness, cold, the taste of grit, panic, blind and primal, seized her. For a second, it wasn't water filling her nose, it was smoke. She wasn't in a gully in Wyoming, she was in the hallway, the heat pressing in. Clara screaming on the other side of the door. "I can't breathe! I can't breathe!" She thrashed, her hands clawing at the water. She broke the surface, coughing, wiping mud from her eyes. The rain was blinding. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing at her hair, which had come loose from its pins and plastered itself across her face. "Help!" she screamed, though the sound was torn away instantly. "Mr. Higgins!" She looked up the embankment. The stagecoach was listing dangerously on the edge of the road, one wheel hanging in space. She couldn't see the driver. She was alone in the cut, the water rising with terrifying speed, churning around her knees, then her thighs. She tried to climb the bank, but the mud was like grease. Her boots found no purchase. She slid back, splashing into the rising torrent. She was going to die here. She had traveled 2,000 miles to escape hell, only to drown in a muddy ditch in the middle of nowhere. Then, through the curtain of rain, a shape emerged. It was a dark silhouette on the rim of the gully, monstrous and large against the lightning-streaked sky. A horse, a big bay, its head tucked against the wind, steam rising from its flanks, and on its back, a rider. He sat immobile for a second, looking down. He wore a long oilskin coat that glistened like the skin of a seal, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. "Hey!" Nora screamed, waving an arm, nearly losing her balance again. The rider did not shout back. He spurred the horse. To Nora's horror, the animal lunged over the edge of the embankment, sliding down the mud in a controlled, terrifying descent. Hooves churned the earth. The rider leaned back in the saddle, his body moving in perfect synchronization with the beast. They hit the water with a massive splash, just yards from where Nora stood shivering. The horse danced sideways, fighting the current, but the rider held it steady with iron hands. He swung down from the saddle, splashing into the knee-deep water. He was tall, looming over her. The brim of his hat shed water in a constant stream. He moved toward her not with panic, but with a grim, efficient purpose. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't introduce himself. He simply reached out and grabbed her by the upper arms, his grip bruisingly tight through her soaked sleeves. Nora was shaking so hard her teeth clattered together. The shock of the fall, the freezing water, and the sudden appearance of this silent giant overwhelmed her. As he yanked her upward, pulling her out of the sucking mud, her mind fractured under the strain of the absurdity of it all. She looked at him, water streaming down her face, her expensive dress ruined, her life in tatters, and she gasped out the first thought that came into her head. "You are getting me all wet." The words hung in the air between them, ridiculous and small against the roar of the storm. The man froze for a fraction of a second. He looked down at her. Rain dripped from his nose. His face was a landscape of rough stubble and weather-beaten skin. A pale, jagged scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into his collar. His eyes, dark and shadowed by his hat, stared at her with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He grunted, a sound that was more vibration than speech. "Ma-am," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "Look at yourself. You are already drowned." He didn't wait for a retort. He turned, dragging her with him toward the horse. "Put your foot in the stirrup," he ordered. Nora fumbled, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. He didn't have patience for it. He grabbed her by the waist, his hands large and calloused, and hoisted her up as if she weighed no more than a sack of grain. She scrambled onto the saddle, straddling it ungracefully. Her wet skirts bunched around her legs. He swung up behind her in one fluid motion. "Hold onto the horn," he said, his chest pressing against her back. He turned the horse toward the bank. With a shout and a kick, the animal surged upward. They scrambled up the slick mud, hooves tearing at the earth, until they crested the lip of the gully and were back on the road. The stagecoach was a wreck. The front axle had snapped. The horses were tangled in their traces, eyeing the storm with wild, rolling eyes. Higgins, the driver, was standing by the lead horse, looking soaked and furious. He looked up as the stranger rode up with Nora. "McCrae!" Higgins shouted, shielding his eyes against the rain. "Is that you?" "It is." The stranger, McCrae, called back. "You ran her right off the road." "Higgins, the road is washed out!" Higgins yelled, gesturing vaguely at the mud. "I cannot go forward. Axel is done for. I've got to unhitch the team and ride back to the station at Cross Creek." Nora twisted in the saddle, looking at the driver in horror. "Go back, but my luggage, my trunk." "Leave it," McCrae said, his voice close to her ear. "It will be there when the mud dries. You cannot stay here." Higgins nodded. "Take her with you. Eli, I cannot carry her double on one of these carriage horses. They are skittish enough as it is. You are only 5 miles out." Nora stiffened. 5 miles? In this? With a stranger? I need to get to Willow Creek." She chattered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "You are not getting to Willow Creek today," McCrae said flatly. "The bridge at the forks will be underwater by now." He shifted in the saddle, adjusting his grip on the reins. His arms came around her, forming a cage of warmth. "We are going to my place," he told her. "It is closer." "I do not know you," Nora whispered, though the wind snatched the words away. McCrae heard her. "You know I just pulled you out of a ditch," he said. "That is enough for now. Hold on." He turned the bay horse away from the road, plunging into the open, trackless prairie. The ride was a blur of misery and confusion. The rain did not let up. It came in waves, driven by a wind that seemed determined to peel the skin from their bones. The temperature dropped further as evening approached. Nora's wet clothes were like icy weights clinging to her skin. She began to shudder, deep, racking tremors that started in her core and shook her whole body. But there was heat behind her, Eli McCrae was a furnace. Pressed against him, Nora could feel the solid, unyielding strength of his chest. He rode with an easy competence, guiding the horse through washes and around stands of dripping sagebrush. He did not speak to her, did not offer empty comforts. He simply rode, his body shielding hers from the worst of the wind at her back. Nora found herself leaning back into him, her exhaustion overriding her propriety. She closed her eyes, listening to the squelch of hooves in mud and the steady rhythm of the horse's breathing. It was intimate, terrifyingly so. She could smell him, wet wool, leather, and the faint, musky scent of a man who worked with the earth. It was a scent far removed from the bay rum and stale cigars of the saloon patrons she was used to. It was raw. How far? She managed to ask after what felt like hours. Almost there, he rumbled. The landscape was bleak. Through the rain, she saw gullies carved by centuries of water, looking like open wounds in the gray light. Distant stands of pine trees on the hills looked like huddled groups of mourners. The sky was a low, oppressive ceiling of charcoal clouds. Finally, a shape emerged from the gloom. It was a ranch, though that word seemed too grand for what she saw. It was a collection of structures huddled in a shallow valley, as if trying to hide from the wind. There was a main house built of weathered logs and rough-cut lumber, a barn that leaned slightly to the west, and several corrals that were turning into mud pits. A dog barked, a sharp sound that cut through the rain. As they rode into the yard, the door of the main house flew open. Two figures rushed out onto the porch, heedless of the rain. One was an older man with a pronounced limp, holding a lantern that swung wildly in the wind. The other was a boy, no more than 14, lanky and wide-eyed. "Eli," the boy shouted. "We thought you were caught at the crossing." McCrae pulled the horse up near the porch. He didn't wait for assistance. He swung his leg over the saddle horn and dropped to the ground, splashing in the mud. He reached up for Nora. "Come on," he said. She tried to dismount, but her legs were numb. She practically fell into his arms. For a moment, he held her entire weight, his hands gripping her waist firmly. She looked up at him, her face inches from his damp coat. His eyes were gray. She noticed for the first time the color of the storm clouds. "Get her inside. Gus," McCrae said to the older man, passing Nora toward the stairs as if she were a parcel. "She is frozen through." The older man, Gus, had a face like a dried apple, wrinkled and brown. He looked Nora up and down, taking in her sodden velvet hat, the mud streaked across her cheek, and the fine cut of her ruined dress. His eyes were sharp with curiosity. "Lord Almighty." "Eli," Gus muttered, ushering her up the steps. "What did you catch in the creek? A mermaid?" Nora stumbled onto the wooden porch, the roof overhead providing a sudden, shocking relief from the pounding rain. The boy, Tommy, stared at her with his mouth slightly open, a mixture of awe and suspicion on his face. I fell," Nora stammered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. "The stage, the wheel." "Inside," Gus commanded, before the wind blows the door off the hinges. They ushered her into the main room of the farmhouse. The heat hit her like a physical blow. A large cast-iron stove stood in the center of the room, radiating a fierce, dry warmth. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and bacon grease. It was a masculine space, sparse, utilitarian, cluttered with gear. A bridle hung on the wall. A rifle rested in the corner. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the rough plank floor. Nora stood in the middle of the room, a puddle forming rapidly around her boots. She began to shake violently, the adrenaline fading, leaving only the bone-deep cold. Eli entered behind them, stomping mud from his boots. He took off his hat and slapped it against his leg, sending a spray of water across the floor. His hair was dark, plastered to his skull, revealing the sharp angles of his face. He looked at Nora, really looked at her. In the light of the kerosene lamp, he frowned. "She is blue," Eli said. "Gus, get the coffee. Tommy, put the horse up and rub him down good. He worked hard." The boy vanished out the door. Gus hobbled to the stove, pouring thick, black liquid into a tin cup. Eli walked past Nora into a side room. She heard the sound of drawers opening and closing. He returned a moment later, holding a bundle of gray fabric and a heavy wool blanket. "Here," he said, thrusting the items at her. Nora looked at the clothes. A flannel shirt, a pair of woolen trousers. I cannot," she whispered, clutching her muddy collar. "You can and you will," Eli said, his voice brooking no argument. "Unless you want to die of pneumonia before morning. There is a screen in the corner over there. Get those wet things off." He pointed to a folding screen in the corner of the room, behind which stood a washstand and a pitcher. Nora hesitated. The impropriety of it was staggering. She was in a strange man's house, miles from civilization, being told to undress. Eli seemed to sense her fear. He turned his back to her, facing the stove. He motioned for Gus to do the same. "We are not looking." "Miss," Eli said, his voice dropping an octave, sounding suddenly weary. "Just get warm." Nora moved behind the screen. Her fingers were so numb she could barely work the buttons of her bodice. She fumbled with the hooks, peeling the sodden layers of wet wool and cotton from her shivering skin. As the heavy dress fell to the floor with a wet slap, she felt incredibly small and exposed. She pulled on the shirt Eli had given her. It was enormous, swallowing her frame. The flannel was rough against her skin, smelling faintly of cedar and tobacco. It carried his heat, or perhaps she just imagined it. She rolled the sleeves up, her hands trembling. She did not put on the trousers. Instead, she wrapped the heavy wool blanket around her waist like a skirt, cinching it tight. When she emerged, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, Eli turned. He had removed his oilskin coat. Underneath, he wore a simple vest and a Henley shirt that clung to his broad shoulders. He looked her over, his expression unreadable. Better, he decided. Sit by the stove. He pulled a wooden chair close to the iron beast. Nora sat, leaning forward, extending her hands toward the heat. The pain of the blood returning to her fingers was excruciating, a sharp, prickly burning. Gus handed her the tin cup. "Drink. It is strong enough to float a horseshoe, but it will warm you." "Thank you," Nora whispered. She took a sip. It was bitter and scorching hot, but it felt like life itself flowing into her veins. "Who are you, then?" Gus asked, leaning against the table, his bad leg taken off the weight. "Not many folks swimming in the creek this time of year." "Nora Bennett," she said, her voice stronger now. "I am the new music teacher for Willow Creek, or I hope I am." Eli was watching her over the rim of his own cup. "A music teacher." He repeated slowly, "You are a long way from a piano." "Miss Bennett, I am from Boston." She lied smoothly, the old reflex kicking in. "Boston?" Gus whistled. "Fancy." Eli said nothing. He watched her hands, the way she held the cup. He looked at the pile of wet, muddy clothes in the corner, clothes that were perhaps a bit too fine for a simple teacher, a bit too velvet and lace. Nora saw his gaze and pulled the blanket tighter. She felt a sudden flash of defiance. Let him look. Let him wonder. He did not know her. He did not know about the smoky room at the Gilded Cage, or the way men looked at her when she stood on that stage. The wind howled outside, rattling the window frames in their sockets. The storm was intensifying. "You will take the spare room tonight," Eli said abruptly, setting his cup down. "It is off the kitchen. It has a latch on the inside." He emphasized the last part, his eyes locking with hers. It was a promise of safety. "Thank you, Mr. McCrae," she said. You saved my life." Eli looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. He rubbed the back of his neck, his hand brushing the scar on his jaw. Road was bad. He muttered, "Anyone would have done it." He stood up. "Gus, help her with the lamp. I'm going to check the stock one last time." He grabbed his wet coat and went back out into the raging dark. Later that night, Nora lay in the narrow bed in the spare room. The sheets were clean, but coarse. The room smelled of dried herbs and dust. She had latched the door, just as Eli had said. Outside, the storm battered the house. Thunder rolled across the prairie, a constant, low-level growl. The wind screamed around the eaves, sounding like voices. like the cries of lost things. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She could hear movement in the main room, the heavy tread of boots, Eli's boots, the murmur of Gus's voice, then the click of the lantern being extinguished. Silence settled over the house, save for the storm. Nora brought her hand up to her face, smelling the sleeve of the flannel shirt she still wore. It smelled of this place, wild, rough, and enduring. She thought of the stagecoach lying on its side in the mud. She thought of her trunk, abandoned in the rain, containing the sheet music she had carefully packed. She thought of the look in Eli McCrae's eyes, tired, guarded, dangerous, yet undeniably decent. She realized then, with a terrifying clarity, that the rules of the world she had left behind did not apply here. In the East, danger came from men in silk vests and the grinding poverty of the streets. Here, the land itself wanted to kill you. The sky could turn into an ocean. The cold could stop your heart. And the only thing standing between her and that vast, consuming dark was a stranger with a scar on his face and a roof that rattled in the wind. She pulled the quilt up to her chin, listening to the rain lash against the logs. And for the first time in years, she did not dream of fire. She dreamed of water, dark and cold, and a hand reaching down to pull her out. The morning arrived not with the gentle unfurling of dawn, but with a harsh, crystalline clarity that hurt the eyes. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of piercing, relentless blue and a world encased in ice. Nora Bennett woke with a start, her breath pluming white in the frigid air of the small spare room. For a moment, disoriented by the silence, she reached for the familiar, lumpy mattress of her boarding house bed in Chicago, only to find rough wool and the smell of pine. Memory rushed back, the stagecoach, the water, the terrifying grip of the stranger who had pulled her from the flood. She sat up, shivering as the quilt slipped from her shoulders. She was wearing Eli McCrae's flannel shirt. It was vast on her, the cuffs rolled thick at her wrists, the hem hitting her knees. It smelled of him, tobacco, horse, and a deep, earthy scent that was strangely comforting. She looked toward the door. Through the cracks in the wood, the smell of frying bacon and strong coffee drifted in, savory and heavy. Nora swung her legs out of bed. The floorboards were like blocks of ice against her bare feet. She hurried to the chair where her undergarments had been draped, finding them dry but stiff. She dressed as best she could, but her blue serge dress was still missing. She opened the door a crack. The main room was bright with morning sun streaming through the uncurtained windows. In the center of the room, near the roaring stove, her dress hung on a line rigged between two chairs. It looked like a hanged criminal, stiff, wrinkled, and mud-stained at the hem, steaming slightly in the heat. Eli stood at the stove, his back to her. He was frying thick slabs of bacon in a cast-iron skillet. The old man, Gus, sat at the table whittling a piece of kindling, while the boy, Tommy, was setting out tin plates with a clatter. Nora hesitated in the doorway. To walk out there, in a strange man's shirt, with her ankles exposed and her hair a tangled mess, felt like a violation of every rule of decency she had ever been taught. But hunger, a sharp and twisting pain in her stomach, overrode her shame. She stepped into the room. "Good morning," she said. Her voice sounded thin and brittle in the large space. The activity in the room ceased instantly. Tommy froze with a fork in midair. Gus looked up, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Eli turned slowly from the stove, a spatula in his hand. His gaze swept over her. It was not leering, but it was direct. He took in the oversized shirt, the bare feet she tried to hide one behind the other, and the flush that she felt rising from her neck to her hairline. "Morning," Eli rumbled. He turned back to the bacon, flipping a piece with a sharp hiss of grease. "Coffee is hot. Dress needs another hour. Likely. The hem is still soaked through." Nora moved toward the table, clutching the front of the shirt closed at her throat. "Thank you, Mr. McCrae. I apologize for the imposition. Sit down." "Girl," Gus said, waving his knife at a chair. "You look like a stiff wind would blow you back to Kansas." "Ain't that right, Eli?" She is thin as a rail." Eli grunted a non-committal agreement as he plated the bacon. He brought the skillet to the table and shoveled food onto the tin plates without ceremony. Biscuits, hard and dense, appeared from a warming shelf on the stove. Nora sat, tucking her legs beneath the chair. The domesticity of it was jarring. She was eating breakfast with 3 strangers in the middle of a wilderness, dependent on their charity for the very clothes on her back. "Eat," Eli commanded, pushing a plate toward her. "I am not very hungry." Nora lied, her manners warring with her starvation. "You will eat," Eli said, sitting opposite her. His face was cleaner today, though the shadow of a beard still darkened his jaw. The scar she had noticed in the rain stood out stark and white against his tanned skin. It pulled slightly at the corner of his mouth when he frowned. "You have got a hollow look about you, Miss Bennet, and the cold out here burns fuel." Nora picked up a biscuit. It was warm. She took a bite, and the taste of flour and lard was wonderful. She ate, conscious of Tommy watching her with unabashed curiosity. "So," Gus said, pouring molasses over his bacon, "you are a teacher?" "Yes," Nora said, wiping crumbs from her lip. "Piano and voice. I have a letter of engagement from the Willow Creek School Board." "Willow Creek," Gus chuckled. He exchanged a look with Eli. "They got a piano in the schoolhouse?" "I assume so," Nora said, feeling a prickle of defensiveness. "Mrs. Dawes assured me the town was developing. Developing is one word for it," Eli said. He poured coffee into her cup, the steam rising between them. "It is a rough place, Miss Bennet. The mines are playing out up north, so we get the drift from that. Cattle money is tight, and the railroad is bringing in all sorts." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching. "It is no place for a woman alone, especially one from the East. I am capable." "Mr. McCrae," Nora said, straightening her spine. "I have survived difficult circumstances before." Eli's eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps catching the edge in her voice, the hint of steel beneath the velvet manners. He did not press her. "The roads are soup," he said, changing the subject. "The creek is over its banks. You will not be getting to town today. Maybe not tomorrow, but I must," Nora said, panic fluttering in her chest. "If I am late, Mrs. Dawes is expecting me." "Then Mrs. Dawes will have to wait," Eli said flatly. "Unless you want to swim, I will take you in the wagon as soon as the mud dries enough to hold a wheel. Until then, you are stuck here." The finality in his tone silenced her. She looked out the window. The world was a blinding white and brown expanse. She was trapped. The days that followed were a test of patience and endurance, unlike anything Nora had known. The mud did not dry. The temperature hovered near freezing, locking the moisture into a slushy, impassable mire. Nora, determined not to be a burden, insisted on helping. "I cannot simply sit by the fire while you work," she told Eli on the second morning, having finally reclaimed her dry, albeit wrinkled, blue dress. Eli had looked at her doubtfully. "Suit yourself, but do not get in the way." She learned quickly that ranch work was a brutal, unending assault on the body. There was no romance in it. It was hauling water from the pump until her shoulders screamed. It was chopping kindling until blisters formed on her palms, broke, and formed again. She tried to milk the cow. A sullen Jersey with a mean streak, the animal kicked the bucket over 3 times, soaking Nora's hem with milk. Tommy laughed until he fell off his milking stool, but Nora just set her jaw, wiped her face, and sat back down. By the end of the hour, she had half a bucket. Eli walked by, paused, looked at the milk, and gave a single, short nod before moving on. It was a victory. The washing was worse. With 4 people, the laundry piled up. Nora took it upon herself to scrub the heavy denim and wool in the galvanized tub. The water was scalding hot from the stove, but the air outside where she had to hang it was biting. She stood in the yard, the wind whipping her skirts around her legs, pinning wet shirts to the line. Her hands turned red, then raw, then cracked. The cold seeped into her bones, a dull ache that never really left. Eli found her there on the 3rd afternoon, He was carrying a saddle over one shoulder. He stopped, watching her struggle to pin a heavy pair of trousers against the gale. "You are bleeding," he said. Nora looked down at her hands. The knuckles were split and oozing. "It is fine," she said, clutching a clothespin. He dropped the saddle on the porch and walked over to her. He reached out and took her hands in his. His palms were like leather, warm and incredibly rough, but his touch was gentle. He turned her hands over, inspecting the damage. "You have got city hands," he said, soft. "The wind here eats soft things." "I am not soft," Nora said quietly, pulling her hands away. He looked at her for a long moment, the wind tossing his dark hair. "No," he said, "maybe you are not." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin, tallow and beeswax. "Put it on at night. It helps." He placed the tin on the railing and walked away. Nora stared at it, her heart beating a strange, erratic rhythm against her ribs. The breakthrough came on the fourth day. The weather had cleared, leaving a crisp, golden light over the ranch. Tommy was in the corral, trying to halter break a young mare that Eli had brought in from the range. The horse was a skittish, wild-eyed roan, terrified of the rope and the boy. Nora was shaking a rug on the porch when she heard the shout. She turned to see the mare rear up, striking out with her forelegs. Tommy, caught off guard, scrambled backward and fell hard into the mud. The horse screamed, a high, panicked sound, and began to buck, kicking at the fence rails. Eli was near the barn, running toward the corral, shouting, but he was too far away. Nora dropped the rug. She did not think. She hitched up her skirts and ran. She reached the corral fence just as Tommy scrambled to safety under the bottom rail. The mare was backed into a corner, heaving, eyes rolling white, trembling with terror. Eli reached the gate, breathless. He grabbed a lariat. "I will snub her down," he growled. "No!" Nora cried out. She climbed through the rails before he could stop her. Eli froze. "Miss Bennett, get out of there. She will kill you." Nora ignored him. She walked slowly toward the mare. She did not look the horse in the eye. She kept her body turned slightly away, her posture non-threatening. "Shh," she hummed, a low, melodic sound. "Easy now." "You are all right," the mare snorted, stomping a hoof, but she did not charge. Nora kept moving, slow, steady steps. She began to sing. It was not a song with words, just a gentle, rhythmic melody she had used 100 times in the tenements to soothe crying babies when their mothers were working. Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the tension in the air. The mare's ears flickered. The wild rolling of her eyes slowed. "There is nothing to hurt you here," Nora murmured, extending a hand slowly. "Just fear. That is all it is. Just fear." She reached the horse. The animal flinched, skin shivering. But Nora did not pull back. She laid her hand on the mare's neck, her touch feather-light. She continued to hum, scratching the spot just behind the ears. The mare let out a long, shuddering breath and lowered her head. Nora leaned her forehead against the horse's neck, whispering soft nonsense. Silence hung over the corral. Nora looked up to see Eli standing by the gate. The lariat hung loose in his hand. He was staring at her with an expression she had not seen before. The wariness was gone, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice quiet. Nora stroked the velvet nose of the horse. "Fear is the same in every creature. Mr. McCrae, children or horses. They just need to know they are not alone." Eli watched her for a moment longer, then nodded. He coiled the rope. "Tommy," he barked, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "Go check the water trough." As Nora climbed back through the fence, Eli offered her a hand. She took it. His grip was firm, lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "You have a way with broken things," he said. Nora looked at him, thinking of her own shattered life. It takes one to know one, I suppose. That evening, the cold descended with a vengeance. The wind died down, leaving a stillness that felt heavy and expectant. Inside the ranch house, the fire was the center of the world. They sat in the golden circle of lamplight. The shadows of the room pressed back into the corners. The exhaustion of the day lay on them like a heavy blanket. Eli sat in his leather chair, mending a bridle. Gus was dozing in the corner. Nora sat on a low stool near the stove, staring into the flames. "Play something," Eli said suddenly. Nora looked up. "Pardon?" Eli gestured with his chin toward the wall where an old guitar hung by a faded red ribbon. "You said you teach music. That thing has not been played in years. Probably sounds like a stepped-on cat, but I would like to hear something other than the wind." Nora hesitated. She had not played since the Gilded Cage. The thought of performing brought a sudden nausea, a flash of stale beer and hungry eyes. But this was different. This was just a man, a boy, and an old ranch hand. She stood and took the guitar down. The wood was dry and scratched, the strings old. She sat back down and tuned it, her ear finding the intervals easily despite the instrument's stubbornness. She strummed a chord. It was rich and mournful. She began to play Hard Times Come Again No More. It was a simple song, a plea for mercy against the harshness of the world. "Let us pause in life's pleasures and count its many tears, while we all sup sorrow with the poor." Her voice filled the room. It was a contralto, smoky and deep, shaped by years of training but roughened by life. It was a voice that held secrets. As she sang, she closed her eyes. She was not in the ranch house anymore. She was back in the tenement, singing to Clara before the fire. Then she was in the saloon, singing to men who did not listen, men who only watched her lips and her throat. The memory was a physical weight. The shame of those nights, the way she had bartered her talent for bread, rose up in her throat. But here, in the quiet, with the wood snapping in the stove, the song felt cleansed. It felt pure again. She finished the last chord, letting the vibration fade into silence. Gus had woken up. He clapped his hands once, a sharp crack. "Lord have mercy," he said, grinning. "That was fine. Miss Bennett, mighty fine. I bet men pay good money for a voice like that back east." Nora flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening of her shoulders, a quick aversion of her eyes, but it was violent in its subtlety. The spell broke. The saloon crashed back into the room. I should retire," she stammered, standing up quickly and setting the guitar aside. Eli was watching her. He had not moved during the song, his hands still on the bridle. He had seen the flinch. His eyes darkened, a question forming there, but he did not ask it. "Good night, Miss Bennett," he said softly. Nora fled to her room. Later, Eli went out to the barn to check the stock. The air was crisp enough to freeze breath in the lungs. He walked down the center aisle, listening to the shifting of the horses in their stalls. He stopped at the bay's stall and rested his hand on the animal's flank. Men pay good money for a voice like that. He thought of the way she had frozen. He had seen that look before. He had seen it on the faces of women in towns where the law was a suggestion and morality was a luxury. He wondered what Nora Bennett was running from. A music teacher from Boston did not know how to calm a panic-stricken horse, and she did not flinch at a compliment unless it carried the weight of an insult she had heard 1,000 times. He looked at his own hands, calloused and scarred. He had his own ghosts. He closed his eyes and saw the raid again. The dust, the confusion, the thunder of hooves, the cattle they had driven off the Circle T range, and the boy, the rancher's son, no older than Tommy, who had ridden out with a shotgun. The gunshot echoed in Eli's mind, sharp and final. He hadn't pulled the trigger. It was Miller who did that, but he had been there. He had ridden with them. The blood was on his soul just the same. He rubbed the scar on his jaw, the grazing wound from the bullet that had nearly killed him that same night. He had ridden away while the boy bled out in the dirt. He had spent 10 years trying to outride that memory, trying to build something decent here on this hard land to pay for a debt that could never be settled. He was a man who did not deserve warmth. And yet, when Nora sang, he had felt something crack inside his chest. He cursed softly into the darkness and went back to the house. The thaw began 2 days later. The sun grew teeth, melting the ice on the roof, sending water dripping in a rhythmic cadence from the eaves. It was late evening. The house was quiet. Gus and Tommy were asleep in the bunkhouse. Nora was in the kitchen, washing the supper dishes. Eli was sitting at the table, going over a ledger, his brow furrowed as he calculated the feed costs against the dwindling supply. Nora dried a plate and moved to the window. "The frost is melting," she said, her voice soft. Eli looked up. "It is. The road should be passable by tomorrow noon." Nora nodded. She felt a strange pang of regret. The ranch had been hard, but it had been safe. She noticed a buildup of ice on the interior sill of the window, water that had refrozen as the temperature dropped with the sun. "I should clear this," she said. "It will rot the wood." She reached up with a small knife to chip at the ice. She had to stand on her tiptoes, leaning over the basin. "Be careful," Eli said, watching her. "The floor is damp there." "It is fine. I have it," she said. She chipped at the ice. A chunk broke free. She leaned further to catch it before it fell. Her boot slipped on a wet plank. Nora gasped as her feet went out from under her. She flailed, tipping backward. Eli moved with the speed of a striking snake. He was out of his chair and across the space in a heartbeat. He caught her, his arm hooked around her waist, hauling her up against him to keep her from hitting the floor. The momentum slammed them together. Nora's hands flew up, bracing against his chest. They froze. Nora was pressed along the length of him. She could feel the hard muscles of his thighs, the rapid rise and fall of his chest. His arm was a band of iron around her waist, holding her suspended. She looked up. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. She could smell the soap he used, the coffee on his breath. Time seemed to warp, stretching out into a long, suffocating silence. The heat between them flared instantly, undeniable and shocking. It was not the predatory heat she had known in the saloon. This was mutual, a magnetic pull that terrified her. Eli's hand tightened slightly on her hip. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. His breathing hitched. Nora felt her own breath catch. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted him to let go. She wanted him never to let go. "Eli," she whispered. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. The sound seemed to wake him. He blinked, the mask of control slipping back into place. He set her upright, his hands lingering for a second to ensure she was steady. Then he stepped back abruptly. "Careful," he said, his voice rough, sounding like gravel grinding together. "Thank you," Nora said, looking at the floor, her cheeks burning as if she had been slapped. Eli turned away, retreating to the other side of the room. I will check the wagon wheels for tomorrow." He grabbed his coat and walked out, leaving the door open for a moment, letting the cold night air rush in to cool the room. The journey to Willow Creek the next day was conducted in a silence that was thick with things unsaid. The wagon rattled over the hardening ruts of the road. The mud had turned to a thick, tacky clay that clung to the wheels, but they moved forward. The landscape opened up around them. The storm had scrubbed the world clean. The sky was a vast, towering dome of blue, endless and overwhelming. Hawks circled in the thermals, screeching their lonely cries. Nora sat on the bench seat beside Eli, keeping a careful distance between them. She looked out at the land, the rolling brown hills, the skeletal cottonwoods along the creek beds, the distant purple bruises of the mountains. It was a brutal land, indifferent to human suffering, yet there was a savage beauty to it that made her throat ache. "It is big," she said quietly. "Too big. Sometimes," Eli answered, keeping his eyes on the horses, "it makes you feel small." "Is that a bad thing? Depends on what you are carrying," he said. Nora looked at him, but he kept his profile to her. She felt small, yes, but for the first time since the fire, she did not feel hopeless. She had survived the storm. She had survived the river. They crested a rise, and Willow Creek spread out below them. It was not much of a town. A single main street churned into mud, lined with false-fronted buildings of raw lumber. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with a faded sign, and a small white church with a steeple that looked ambitious for the size of the structure. "This is it," Eli said. Nora straightened her hat. She brushed a speck of dust from her dress. She was Nora Bennett, music teacher. They rolled into town. People stopped on the boardwalks to watch them pass. Nora felt the weight of their eyes. She sat straighter, lifting her chin. Eli pulled the wagon up in front of a small house near the church. A sign painted neatly on a board read, "School." 2 women were standing on the porch. One was tall and severe, wearing a dress of black bombazine that seemed to absorb the light. Her lips were pinched into a tight line. The other was rounder, softer, but her eyes held a guarded suspicion. Eli set the brake and hopped down. He walked around to help Nora, offering his hand. She took it, feeling the calluses again. "Good luck," he murmured, so low only she could hear. Nora stepped down into the mud. She walked toward the porch, Eli trailing a step behind her like a bodyguard. "Mrs. Dawes?" Nora asked, forcing a smile. "I am Nora Bennett." The tall woman did not smile back. She looked Nora up and down. She looked at the mud on the hem of the blue dress. She looked at the way Nora's hair, though pinned, had a wind-blown looseness to it. And she looked at Eli McCrae standing behind her. "You are late, Miss Bennett." "Mrs." Dawes said. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "The storm," Nora explained. "The road was washed out. Mr. McCrae was kind enough to offer me shelter." "Mrs." Dawes' eyes flicked to Eli, then back to Nora. A distinct chill settled over the conversation. "Shelter, Mrs." Dawes repeated. "For 3 days, the roads were impassable," Eli said, his voice hard. "Mrs." Dawes sniffed. The other woman, the pastor's wife, leaned in and whispered something to her companion. "We expected you on the stage." "Miss Bennett, Mrs." Dawes said. "Willow Creek is a God-fearing community. We value modesty and propriety." Nora felt the cold seep back into her blood. It was not the cold of the wind. It was the cold of judgment. She recognized the look in Mrs. Dawes' eyes. It was a look that sensed a crack in the armor, a look that smelled a history she tried to hide. "I assure you, Mrs. Dawes," Nora said, her voice trembling slightly. "My conduct was nothing but proper. I am here to teach music. Mrs." Dawes folded her hands in front of her. "We shall see," she said. "The position is probationary. We will discuss your lodging. You cannot stay at the hotel. It is not suitable." Nora stood in the muddy street, the hope she had felt on the ridge evaporating. She felt the heavy, suffocating blanket of small-town morality descending on her. Eli stepped forward, his shadow falling over Nora. "She is a good teacher," he said, staring Mrs. Dawes down. "She can handle a wild horse. I reckon she can handle your children." "Mrs." Dawes bristled. "We shall see. Mr. McCrae, good day." She turned and marched into the schoolhouse, the pastor's wife following, leaving Nora and Eli standing in the mud. Nora looked at the closed door, then back at Eli. "Welcome to Willow Creek," he said grimly. Nora took a deep breath. She had survived the fire. She had survived the flood. She would survive Mrs. Dawes. "Thank you, Eli," she said, "for everything." Eli touched the brim of his hat. He looked like he wanted to say more, to offer some protection against the vultures. But he knew it would only make it worse. "I will see you around." "Nora," he said. He climbed back into the wagon and flicked the reins. Nora watched him ride away, the only anchor she had in this cold, hard world, disappearing down the muddy street. She turned back to the closed door of the schoolhouse, squared her shoulders, and knocked. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was as brittle as dry prairie grass. Nora Bennett found lodging with Mrs. Gable, a widowed storekeeper whose kindness was as practical and spare as the room she'd rented out above the dry goods shop. The room was clean, smelling of lye soap and sawdust, but it was cold. The walls were thin, and every night Nora lay awake listening to the wind rattle the loose siding, feeling the town of Willow Creek breathing around her, suspicious, watchful, and judging. Her days were spent in the small, drafty schoolhouse, under the watchful eye of Mrs. Dawes. who sat in the back of the room during music lessons like a crow on a fence post, waiting for a mistake. Nora taught scales and simple hymns to children who stared at her with wide, curious eyes, sensing that she was something exotic and perhaps dangerous. But the weekends belonged to the ranch. Every Friday afternoon, Eli would arrive in the wagon to fetch her. The sight of his battered hat and the team of horses became the only point of light in her week. The journey out of town was a shedding of skin. As the buildings of Willow Creek faded into the dust, the tightness in Nora's chest would loosen. At the ranch, she was not the probationer under scrutiny. She was simply Nora. She taught Tommy to read by the light of the fire, her finger tracing the words in an old almanac. She helped Gus peel potatoes, her hands growing rougher but steadier. She learned to mend fences, holding the wire taut while Eli hammered the staples, their movements becoming a silent dance of cooperation. It was a hard life. The wind never stopped. The work never ended. But in the evenings, when the wind howled outside and the stove glowed red, there was an honesty to it that the town lacked. Here, she was judged by how well she worked, not by where she had come from, or so she hoped. The trouble began on a Tuesday. Nora was walking down the boardwalk toward the mercantile to buy thread when she noticed the silence. It was a subtle shift. Two women standing outside the milliner's shop stopped talking as she approached, tracking her with eyes that were hard and bright. A group of men loitering near the livery stable fell quiet, then burst into low, gritty laughter as she passed. She kept her head high, clutching her shawl, but her heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She entered the store. Mrs. Gable was behind the counter, looking pale and tight-lipped. Mrs. Gable, Nora said, forcing a smile. I need a spool of blue thread. The widow did not smile back. She reached under the counter and slapped a piece of paper onto the wood. It was a broadsheet, wrinkled and stained with coffee rings, clearly discarded by a traveler passing through on the stagecoach. It was old, printed on cheap yellow paper. The ink was faded, but the image was clear enough. It was a woodcut sketch of a woman in a low-cut gown, standing by a piano, head thrown back in song. The headline read, "The Nightingale of the West. Live at the Gilded Cage. Come hear the sirens sing." The likeness was crude, but the eyes were unmistakable. Mrs. Gable tapped the paper with a bony finger. "A drummer from Kansas City left this at the saloon," she said, her voice shaking with righteous indignation. "He said he saw you perform. He said you were the main attraction." Nora stared at the paper. It felt like looking at a ghost. Shame, hot and prickly, flooded her veins. "It was a job, Mrs. Gable," Nora whispered. "I had nothing. I had to eat. Mrs. Gable snatched the paper back. "We are decent people here. Miss Bennett, we do not hold with theatrical women." Nora left the store without the thread. As she walked back to the schoolhouse, the whispers seemed to rise from the dust itself. Songbird, siren, fallen. The words were not spoken aloud, but they hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eli heard it 3 days later. He had come into town for supplies, flour, coffee, and a box of nails for the barn roof. He tied the team in front of the general store and headed for the saloon to wash the dust from his throat before the long ride back. The saloon was dim and smelled of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Eli ordered a whiskey and stood at the bar, his back to the room. He heard the name Bennett drift through the smoke. "She is staying at the widow's place," a man's voice said. A rough voice, slurred with drink. "I tell you, I saw the picture. Same eyes, same hair. They say she sang for the miners in Deadwood." Another man laughed. "Singing is not all they do in those places. I bet she knows a few tricks that Mrs. Dawes does not teach in Sunday school." Eli's hand tightened on his glass. The glass was thick, cheap crystal, but he felt it groan under the pressure of his grip. "I would pay $5 to find out," the first man chuckled. "Maybe she is lonely out there at McCrae's place on the weekends. Maybe that is how she pays for her board." The glass shattered. Whiskey and blood spilled onto the polished wood of the bar. The sound of the break silenced the room. Eli stood there for a second, looking at the shards embedded in his palm. He felt a red-hot surge of rage, a desire to turn around and beat the man until his teeth were gone. He wanted to break every bone in the coward's face, but he stopped. He saw the reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He saw a man with a scar on his jaw and violence in his eyes. He saw the outlaw he used to be. If he fought now, if he drew blood, he would only prove them right. He would confirm every whisper about himself and, by extension, every lie about Nora. He tossed a coin onto the bar, ignoring the blood dripping from his hand. "Keep the change," he growled to the bartender. He walked out of the saloon, his boots heavy on the floorboards, leaving the men in a stunned, uneasy silence. He did not look back. When he picked Nora up that Friday, the air between them was thick with unsaid things. The ride to the ranch was brutal. A northerly wind had kicked up, cutting through coats and gloves. Nora sat huddled on the bench seat, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She did not speak. She stared at the horizon as if she were waiting for it to swallow her whole. When they arrived, she did not go to the house. She went straight to the barn. Eli unhitched the team, his heart aching with a helpless fury. He watched her go, a small, dark figure against the gray wood of the barn. He gave Gus the horses and followed her. He found her in the stall with the roan mare. She had her arms wrapped around the horse's neck, her face buried in the coarse mane. Her shoulders were shaking. "Nora," Eli said softly. She turned. Her face was ravaged by tears. The composure she wore like armor in town had shattered completely. "They know. Eli," she choked out. "They all know." Eli stepped into the stall. The smell of straw and horse sweat was strong, a grounding scent in the midst of her panic. "I know what they are saying," he said. "It is just noise. Nora, just wind." "It is not just noise," she cried, pulling away from the horse. "It is my life. I walked down the street today and a man asked me how much I charged for a private lesson. He laughed at me. Eli," she sank onto a bale of hay, covering her face with her hands. "I tried so hard." She sobbed. "I just wanted to be clean. I just wanted a place where no one looked at me like I was for sale." Eli stood over her, feeling useless. He wanted to touch her, to comfort her, but his own hands felt too rough, too stained. "Tell me," he said, his voice rough. "Tell me the truth of it, not what they say. What happened?" Nora looked up, her eyes swimming. "My sister," she whispered. "Clara." She was 17. The fire. It started in the basement of the tenement. We were on the 4th floor. The smoke was so black. I held her hand. Eli, I held her hand until I could not hold it anymore. She took a shuddering breath. I was alone. I had no money, no family. The landlord put me on the street the next day. I went to the employment agency. But I had no references. I went to the church, but they had no room. I was starving, truly starving. I walked past the gilded cage and I heard the piano. I walked in and told the owner I could sing. She looked at Eli, defiance mixing with the shame in her eyes. He hired me. And yes, I sang. And yes, men bought me drinks. And yes, sometimes they tried to touch me. And sometimes the owner told me I had to be nice if I wanted to keep my job. But I never sold myself. Eli, I never let them take that last piece of me. I saved every penny, every single coin, to get here, to be someone else. Her voice broke. And now it is all for nothing. Eli looked at her. He saw the strength beneath the ruin. He saw a survivor, just like him. "It is not for nothing," he said. He sat down on the bale beside her. The lantern light flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. "You want truth?" he asked. "Here is mine." He touched the scar on his jaw. "I did not get this falling off a horse. I got it in '65. After the war, I drifted. I was angry. I had seen too much death and I figured the world owed me something. I rode with a man named Silas and a few others. We took cattle mostly, sometimes payrolls." Nora stopped crying. She watched him, her breath hitching. "We hit a ranch down near the border." Eli continued, his voice monotone. "Detached. It was supposed to be easy. Just run off the herd. But the rancher's son woke up. He came out with a shotgun. He was a boy. Nora, no older than Tommy. Eli looked down at his hands, turning them over. One of the men I rode with. He did not hesitate. He shot the boy, just like that. I saw him fall. I saw the blood on the dust. And in that second, I knew I was damned. I turned my horse. I tried to stop it. But the rancher came out firing. A bullet grazed my jaw. I rode for 3 days without stopping. I left the gang. I left the money. I came here, bought this rocky patch of dirt. And I have been trying to scrub that boy's blood off my hands for 10 years. He looked at her. The town is right about me. Nora, I am an outlaw. I am a thief, and maybe worse. The silence in the barn was absolute. The only sound was the chewing of the horses and the wind outside. Nora reached out. Her hand, trembling slightly, moved toward his face. Her fingers brushed the white, jagged line of the scar on his jaw. Her touch was cool, but it burned his skin like a brand. "You are not that man," she whispered. "Not anymore." Eli turned his head, pressing his cheek into her palm. The contact broke something open inside him, a dam of loneliness he had built carefully over a decade. He covered her hand with his own. His skin was rough against her smoothness. "Nora," he breathed. They moved together as if drawn by gravity. It was not a smooth, practiced motion. It was desperate. Eli leaned in, and Nora tilted her head. Their lips met. It was a collision of grief and longing. It tasted of salt tears and dust. It was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. But then Eli's hand came up to cup the back of her head, tangling in her hair, and the kiss deepened. It became fierce, a seeking of warmth in a cold world. Nora clung to his shoulders, pulling him closer, needing to feel the solid reality of him. For a moment, there was no town, no rumors, no past. There was only the heat of their bodies and the desperate, aching need to be known and accepted. Then, the memory of the saloon crashed into Nora's mind, the feeling of hands grabbing at her dress, the transactional nature of a man's touch. She pulled back with a sharp gasp. "No," she whispered, panic flaring in her eyes. I cannot." She scrambled up from the hay bale, backing away until she hit the stall door. Her chest was heaving. "I am sorry," she stammered. "I am so sorry. I should not have. I cannot do this. It ruins everything." Eli stood up slowly. The loss of her warmth was a physical blow. He saw the fear in her eyes, and his own demons rose up to meet it. He had touched her, and he had frightened her. He was the brute the town thought he was. "You are right," he said, his voice flat and hard, closing the door on the emotion he had just let out. "You are right. I had no right." He stepped back, putting distance between them. The air, which had been electric a moment before, was now charged with a jagged, uncomfortable tension. "Go inside. Nora," he said. "It is cold. Yes." She turned and fled the barn, leaving Eli alone with the horses and the ghosts of the past that refused to stay buried. The following weeks were a torture of politeness. They treated each other like strangers who shared a table. Nora continued her lessons with Tommy, but she avoided Eli's gaze. Eli worked himself to exhaustion, staying out on the range until long after dark, coming in only to eat and sleep. But the world outside did not pause for their discomfort. A new stagecoach arrived in Willow Creek, and with it came a man who walked as if he owned the pavement he stepped on. Silas Kincaid was a man of the New West. He wore a suit of fine broadcloth, a silk vest, and a hat that cost more than a month of Eli's wages. He had a smile that showed too many teeth and eyes that looked like polished flint. He introduced himself as a land agent for the railroad, a representative of progress. He bought drinks for the men in the saloon. He tipped his hat to the ladies. He spoke of the future, of tracks laying down gold across the valley. But when Nora saw him, her blood turned to ice. She was coming out of the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon. Kincaid was standing across the street, talking to the banker. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over her with a casual indifference that suddenly sharpened into recognition. His smile widened. It was slow, predatory, and terrified her more than any shout could have. He crossed the street, his boots crunching in the drying mud. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "Or do you go by another name these days?" Nora clutched her books to her chest. "Mr. Kincaid." "I was surprised to hear a familiar voice in this dusty little hamlet," he said, leaning on his cane. "The last time I saw you, you were wearing significantly less. And singing The Rose of Tralee. I am a teacher now," Nora said, her voice shaking. "Of course you are," Kincaid chuckled. "A teacher? How charming. And does the school board know about your previous employment? Or about the debts you left behind in St. Louis?" "I owe you nothing," Nora said. Kincaid's face hardened. His charm evaporated, revealing the shark beneath. "You owe me for the patronage, my dear, and you owe me for the silence. For now." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Nora trembling on the steps. Kincaid did not waste time. He was a man who understood leverage. He visited the bank the next day. He sat in the private office with the banker, a weak-chinned man named Mr. Abernathy, and laid out a stack of currency that smelled of fresh ink. By noon, Kincaid owned the notes on 3 local ranches. One of them was the McCrae place. Eli found out when he went to make his monthly payment. Mr. Abernathy would not look him in the eye. "The note has been sold." "Eli," the banker mumbled, shuffling papers. "Mr. Kincaid holds the mortgage now. You will have to deal with him." Eli walked out of the bank, his stomach churning with a cold dread. He knew Kincaid, not as a land agent, but as the man he had ridden with 10 years ago. Silas Kincaid was the man who had ordered the raid. Silas Kincaid was the man who had laughed when the boy died. Eli found him in the hotel dining room, eating a steak. "Silas," Eli said, standing by the table. Kincaid looked up, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "Eli, I wondered when you would show up. You look weathered. The ranching life must be hard on the Constitution." "What do you want, Silas?" Eli asked, keeping his hands away from his hips. "I want what is best for the railroad." Kincaid smiled. "And the railroad needs land. Your land. Specifically, the grade through your valley is perfect for the new spur." "I am not selling," Eli said. "Oh, I think you will," Kincaid said, picking up his wine glass. "You are 3 months behind on your payments. Eli, the interest is accruing. And now that I hold the paper, well, let us just say I am not as forgiving as Mr. Abernathy." He took a sip of wine. "Besides, it would be a shame if the sheriff found out that the respectable rancher Mr. McCrae is actually the wanted outlaw who rode with the Red River Gang. There is still a bounty in Texas, I believe." Eli went still. "You were there too, Silas," he said quietly. Kincaid laughed. "I was a businessman then, and I am a businessman now. And who do you think they will believe, the wealthy railroad agent, or the man with the scar and the dirt under his fingernails?" Eli turned and walked away. He had no leverage. He had no money. And now, the wolf was at the door. The tension in town ratcheted up. Kincaid began to pressure the other small ranchers. He cut fences. He poisoned water holes. He spread rumors that the railroad was going to bypass the town entirely if they did not sell, driving property values into the dirt. And he kept his eyes on Nora. One evening, Nora stayed late at the store to help Mrs. Gable with inventory. It was dark when she left, the moon obscured by drifting clouds. She walked around the back of the store to the alleyway that served as a shortcut to her boarding house entrance. A shadow detached itself from the wall. "Going somewhere, Songbird?" Nora gasped, dropping her basket. Kincaid stepped into the dim light. He smelled of expensive cologne and ruthlessness. "Leave me alone," Nora said, backing up. Kincaid moved faster than a man with a cane should. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You have been avoiding me." "Nora," he hissed. "I do not like being ignored. Let go of me." Kincaid pulled her closer. His face was a mask of cold fury. "I have a proposition for you. You want to keep your little secret? You want to keep playing schoolmarm? Then you are going to help me." "Help you do what?" Nora cried, struggling. "Convince your friend McCrae to sign the deed over. He is stubborn." But I see the way he looks at you. You twist him. Nora, you get him to sign, and I forget I ever saw you in a corset. I will never help you, she spat. Kincaid twisted her arm behind her back. She cried out in pain. You will, he whispered, or I will tell every pious hypocrite in this town exactly what you cost for an hour. And then I will tell them about your sister, how you let her burn. Nora stopped struggling. The cruelty of it took her breath away. That is enough. The voice came from the end of the alley. It was a roar. Eli stood there. He had been coming to check on Nora, uneasy about Kincaid's presence in town. He saw Kincaid holding her. He saw the fear on her face. Something snapped in Eli. The restraint he had shown in the saloon, the caution he had lived with for 10 years, it all evaporated. He did not walk. He charged. Kincaid shoved Nora aside, sending her stumbling into the dirt. He reached for the pistol inside his coat, but he was too slow. Eli hit him. It was not a gentleman's punch. It was a blow meant to end a fight. Eli's fist connected with Kincaid's jaw. The sound of the impact sickeningly loud. Kincaid went down hard, his cane clattering away. Eli stood over him, chest heaving, fists clenched. Touch her again, Eli snarled, his voice trembling with a terrifying rage. And I will kill you. I do not care about the law. I do not care about the past. I will put you in the ground. Kincaid scrambled back, wiping blood from his lip. He looked at Eli, and for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. He saw the killer he remembered from the war. You are making a mistake. McCrae, Kincaid spat, scrambling to his feet. You just assaulted a railroad agent. You are finished. Both of you. He retrieved his hat and backed away, disappearing into the darkness of the main street. Eli turned to Nora. She was sitting in the dust, clutching her wrist. He dropped to his knees beside her. The rage vanished, replaced by a frantic worry. Did he hurt you? Eli asked, his hands hovering over her but afraid to touch. Nora looked at him. She saw the violence he was capable of, but she also saw that it was born of a desperate need to protect her. He knows. Eli, she whispered. He knows everything. Eli reached out and gently took her uninjured hand. Let him know, he said. Let him tell the whole world. I am done hiding, Nora, and I am done letting men like him win. He helped her up. They stood in the dark alley, the threat of Kincaid hanging over them like a blade. But for the first time since the barn, they were standing together. Come on, Eli said, his voice steady. I am taking you home, to the ranch. You are not safe here. Nora did not argue. She let him lead her to the wagon, leaving the town and its judgment behind, heading back into the storm that was gathering on the horizon. The winter of 1879 descended upon the Wyoming Territory like a judgment from the Old Testament. It was not merely a season, it was a siege. The temperature plummeted until the mercury in the thermometer outside the general store simply ceased to register. Huddling in the bulb as if terrified to ascend, the wind, which had always been a constant companion, turned into a razor, stripping the warmth from anything living within minutes of exposure. At the McCrae Ranch, the world had shrunk to the distance between the house and the barn. The horizon, once a promise of freedom, was now a blinding white void that erased the distinction between earth and sky. Eli spent his days in a brutal war against the elements. The cattle were dying. They huddled in the lees of the hills, their breath freezing on their muzzles, their ribs showing through thick winter coats as the grass remained buried under 3 feet of drift. Every morning, Eli and Tommy would ride out, breaking ice on the creek with sledgehammers, the sound cracking through the silent air like gunshots. The feed was running low. The price of hay in town had tripled as supply wagons failed to make the pass, and Eli knew, with a sinking stone in his gut, that Silas Kincaid was behind the scarcity. Kincaid was squeezing the county, buying up grain and holding it, waiting for the ranchers to starve out or sell out. Inside the ranch house, the mood was tense but defiant. Nora had moved her few belongings back from Mrs. Gable's room in town. The decision had been made in a flurry of quiet anger after Mrs. Dawes had publicly dismissed her from the schoolhouse steps. claiming that parents were concerned about the moral influence of a woman with such a clouded history. Nora had stood tall, clutching her carpet bag, and told the woman, "I would rather freeze in an honest man's house than sit warm in a hypocrite's parlor." But the town did not let her go quietly. The gossip had turned vicious. Pastor Whitfield devoted an entire Sunday sermon to the sanctity of the hearth and the dangers of the Jezebel spirit, never naming Nora but looking directly at the empty pew where she usually sat. When Nora walked into the mercantile for flour, mothers pulled their children behind their skirts, whispering behind gloved hands. Nora bore it with a rigid dignity, but Eli saw the toll it took. He saw it in the way she stared into the fire at night, her fingers tracing the patterns on the arm of the chair. He saw it in the way she flinched when the wind howled, as if the voices of the town were carried on the gale. Yet, in this isolation, something fragile and beautiful began to take root between them. The nights were long. To save oil, they lit only one lamp, sitting close to the wood stove as the house popped and groaned under the freezing temperatures. Gus would retire early to the bunkhouse, claiming the snoring of the wind helped him sleep, and Tommy would bury himself under a mountain of quilts in the loft, leaving Nora and Eli alone in the gold-tinted dark. They talked. At first, it was about the ranch, the cattle, the feed, the ice. But slowly, the conversations drifted to places they had kept guarded. "I always wanted a piano of my own," Nora said one night, her voice low. Not a saloon piano with cigarette burns on the keys, a real one. Mahogany. I used to imagine having a room with a big window, and children coming in for lessons, not because they had to, but because they wanted to hear the music. Eli looked at her from his chair. He was whittling a replacement handle for an axe, the shavings curling onto the floor. "You would be a good teacher," he said. "You are patient, even with that mule-headed mare. I do not know if I will ever get the chance again," she answered, pulling her shawl tighter. "Mrs. Dawes has a long memory." "Towns change," Eli said. "People forget, or they find something new to hate. If we can hold on to this land. Nora, if we can just get through the winter, maybe we could build that room, right here." Nora looked up at him, surprise softening her face. "You would want that? A school here?" "I would want whatever keeps you here," Eli said, the words slipping out before he could weigh them. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not awkward. It was charged with a terrifying hope. That night, the wind shifted, coming down from the north with a banshee scream. Nora went to bed in the spare room, burying herself under the heavy wool blankets. But sleep was a fitful, dangerous thing. She was back in New York, the smell of cabbage and old damp wood. Then, the smell of smoke. The heat was rising through the floorboards. She was running down the hallway, the wallpaper peeling and curling from the heat. She pounded on the door. "Clara, Clara, open the door!" But the handle was red hot. The flames roared like a living beast, consuming the air, consuming the scream in her throat. "Nora!" The voice cut through the smoke. "Nora! Wake up!" she gasped, sitting bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was blind in the darkness, flailing, fighting off the phantom flames. Strong hands grabbed her shoulders. "It is a dream." Eli's voice was rough with sleep, but steady. "You are safe. You are at the ranch." Nora blinked, the reality of the freezing room crashing in on her. She was shivering violently, her nightgown soaked with cold sweat. Eli was sitting on the edge of her bed, illuminated only by the faint gray light of the snow outside the window. He was wearing his long underwear, his hair tousled, his face etched with concern. I could not get to her," Nora sobbed, the horror still clinging to her. "The door was stuck. I left her there." Eli pulled her into his arms. He did not hesitate. He wrapped her in his strength, rocking her gently as she wept into his chest. "You were a child," he murmured, his hand stroking her hair. "You survived. That is not a sin. Nora, survival is not a sin. I am so afraid," she whispered against his neck. "Not just of the fire, of all of it. Kincaid, the town. I feel like I'm trapped in a burning house again, and there is no way out." "You are not trapped," Eli said fiercely. "I am here. I am not going to let the fire touch you. Do you hear me? I will burn the whole world down before I let them hurt you." The intensity of his voice shifted something in the room. The comfort turned into something else. Nora pulled back slightly to look at him. In the shadows, his eyes were dark and searching. She felt the heat of his body through the thin cotton of her gown, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the room. She realized, with a sudden, sharp intake of breath, that he was the only thing in the world that felt solid. "Eli," she breathed. She reached up, her hand cupping his jaw, her thumb brushing the scar. He went still. Then, with a low groan that sounded like it was torn from his chest, he leaned in. His mouth found hers. It was not gentle. It was a kiss born of desperation, of two people standing on the edge of a cliff in a storm. Nora opened to him, her hands clutching his shoulders, pulling him closer. She wanted to disappear into him. She wanted to forget the cold, the debts, the shame. Eli's hands moved over her back, pulling her flush against him. The blanket fell away. The cold air bit at their skin, but the heat between them was a furnace. His mouth moved to her neck, his beard rough against her soft skin, making her gasp. For a moment, she let herself fall. She let herself want him with a hunger that terrified her. But then, a voice from the past whispered in her ear, "That is what you are good for. That is all you are." She stiffened. The shame, deep and ingrained, rose up like bile. Eli felt the change instantly. He froze. He pulled back, his breathing ragged, his forehead resting against hers. "Nora?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I am sorry," she whispered, trembling. Eli moved his hands from her waist to her shoulders, holding her steady but creating space. "Do not apologize," he said firmly. He took a deep breath, fighting for control. Nora could feel the tension in his muscles, the desire radiating off him, but he did not move to close the gap. "I am not them." "Nora," he said, looking her in the eye, "I am not the men who bought you drinks, and I am not Kincaid." He brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his touch impossibly gentle for a man with such rough hands. "I want you," he admitted, the truth stark and vulnerable. "God knows I want you, but I will never take what you do not freely give. Not ever." The tears welled up in Nora's eyes again, but this time they were not from fear. The restraint, the respect in his voice, broke her heart in a way the cruelty never had. It made the ache for him deeper, sharper. "Stay?" she whispered. "Just stay?" Eli nodded. He lay down on top of the quilt, pulling the heavy blankets over both of them. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her back against his chest. They lay there in the dark, fully clothed but intimately bound. Listening to the wind scream outside, Nora fell asleep to the rhythm of his heartbeat, safe in the eye of the storm. The truce with the world could not last. 2 days later, a group of 4 men rode up to the ranch gate. They were not lawmen, and they were not neighbors. They wore heavy coats and low hats, and their horses were well fed, a luxury few in the valley could afford that winter. Eli was in the south pasture. Gus was in the barn, mending a harness. The men did not knock. They kicked the barn door open. Gus, startled, stood up, clutching a pitchfork. "What is the meaning of this?" The leader, a man with a broken nose and a bowler hat, grinned. "Mr. Kincaid sends his regards. He wants to know when Mr. McCrae plans to settle his account." "Eli is not here," Gus said, backing up. "And you are trespassing." The leader nodded to the man beside him. "Show him the property line. Boys, they beat him. It was efficient and cruel. They knocked the old man down and kicked him in the ribs until he stopped wheezing protests." Tommy, who had been in the loft, shouted and scrambled down the ladder, grabbing a shovel. The big man caught the boy by the collar and slammed him against a stall wall, holding a knife to his throat. "Tell McCrae," the leader said, spitting on the floor near Gus's head. That accidents happen, barns burn down, cattle wander off, and pretty little school teachers, well, the prairie is a lonely place for a woman. They heard hoofbeats then. Eli was coming in at a gallop, having seen the strange horses from the ridge. The men released Tommy and mounted up, meeting Eli in the yard. Eli slid his horse to a halt, his hand already on the rifle in his scabbard. "Get off my land," he snarled. "Just a friendly visit." "McCrae," the leader said, tipping his hat. "Think about the offer. The price goes down every day." They rode off, laughing. Eli rushed into the barn to find Gus groaning on the floor, and Tommy white-faced and shaking. The rage that filled Eli then was cold and black. He helped Gus to the house, his jaw set in a line of granite. He did not say a word, but the look in his eyes frightened Nora more than the storm. "We have to go to the sheriff," Nora said as she bathed the cuts on Gus's face. "The sheriff belongs to Kincaid," Eli said, cleaning his rifle. "There is no law here but what we make." The tension stretched tight over the next week. Supplies ran dangerously low. They were out of coffee, and the flour bin was scraping bottom. "I have to go to town," Nora said one morning. "No," Eli said. "It is too dangerous." "You cannot go," Nora argued. "You have to move the herd to the lower pasture today, or we will lose the calves. Gus cannot ride, and Tommy is not strong enough to do it alone. I will take the mare. I will be quick. I will go straight to the store and back." Eli hesitated. The cattle were indeed in critical condition. If he didn't move them to the windbreak, they would freeze by nightfall. "Take the colt," he said, pulling a heavy revolver from a drawer. "I do not know how to use it," Nora said. "Point and pull," Eli said grimly, "and do not stop for anyone." Nora rode out under a sky the color of bruised iron. The air was still, the calm before another snow. She reached town without incident, bought the flour and coffee, and endured the silent stares of the townspeople. She felt eyes on her back as she left, a prickling sensation that made her kick the mare into a trot. She was halfway home, passing through a narrow ravine known as Devil's Cut, when the trap sprung. The silence of the afternoon was shattered by the whistle of a rope. A lariat dropped over her shoulders, cinching tight instantly. Nora screamed, grabbing at the rope, but the force jerked her backward. She flew off the mare, hitting the frozen ground with a bone-jarring thud. The air was knocked from her lungs. She gasped, staring up at the rim of the ravine. 3 men stood there. The hired men, the leader, the one with the bowler hat, jumped down the embankment, sliding in the scree. "Well now," he leered. "Look what we caught. A little bird." Nora scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the sharp rocks. She reached for the saddlebag where the gun was, but the horse had skittered away. Frightened, "Please," she gasped. "Take the money. Take the horse." "We do not want the horse," the man said. He grabbed her ankle and dragged her down the slope. Nora kicked out, her boot connecting with his shin, but he just laughed. He pinned her down, his weight crushing. The smell of whiskey and unwashed wool filled her nose. "Kincaid said to scare you," he whispered, his hand grabbing the front of her coat. But he did not say we could not have a little fun first. Panic, absolute and white-hot, exploded in Nora's brain. It was the saloon nightmare come to life. She clawed at his face, her nails raking his cheek. He struck her, a backhanded slap that split her lip and made the world spin. "Hold her legs," he shouted to the others who were sliding down the bank. Then, a gunshot cracked the air. Dirt exploded next to the leader's head. He froze. On the opposite rim of the ravine, a rider sat silhouetted against the gray sky. Eli. He did not speak. He spurred his horse, and for the second time in their lives, Nora watched him launch himself down a sheer embankment to save her. He hit the bottom of the ravine like a landslide. He didn't wait for the horse to stop. He launched himself from the saddle, tackling one of the standing men. The fight was a blur of violence. It was not a duel. It was a brawl in the dirt. Eli fought with a ferocity that was terrifying to behold. He broke the nose of the first man with a headbutt. He took a knife slash to the forearm from the second, but didn't seem to feel it, driving his fist into the man's gut until he doubled over. The leader, recovering from his shock, pulled a knife from his boot. He lunged at Eli's back while Eli was engaged with the others. "Eli!" Nora screamed. She grabbed a rock, jagged and heavy with frost. With all her strength, she hurled it. It struck the leader in the shoulder, staggering him just as he was about to strike. Eli spun around. He saw the knife. He saw Nora on the ground. He roared, a sound of pure primal fury. He caught the leader's wrist, twisting it until the bone snapped with a wet crack. The man screamed and dropped the knife. Eli drove a knee into his chest, sending him sprawling into the frozen creek bed. "Get out!" Eli bellowed, standing over them, blood dripping from his arm, his chest heaving. "Tell Kincaid next time I will not stop." The men, broken and bleeding, scrambled up the bank, leaving their horses, running for their lives. Eli stood there for a moment, swaying slightly. Then he turned to Nora. The rage drained out of him instantly, leaving only a desperate terror. He fell to his knees beside her. "Nora," he gasped, reaching for her. She flung herself into his arms. She did not care about the blood. She did not care about the pain in her face. She buried her face in his neck, sobbing uncontrollably. "I have you," he repeated, rocking her back and forth on the cold ground. "I have you." The ride back to the ranch was slow. Nora sat in front of Eli on his horse, his arms wrapped tight around her, shielding her from the wind and the world. When they got inside, the house was warm. Gus took one look at them, Eli's bleeding arm, Nora's swollen lip, and took the horses without a word. Nora led Eli to the kitchen chair. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to be steady. She pumped water into a basin and brought a clean cloth. "Take off your shirt," she said softly. Eli winced as he peeled the flannel off. The knife cut on his forearm was deep and ugly, welling with dark blood. His ribs were bruising already from where he had been kicked. Nora dipped the cloth in the water. She began to wash the blood away. The water turned pink in the basin. She touched his skin with a reverence that made her throat ache. This body, this scarred, battered body, had stood between her and the abyss. He watched her face as she worked. He reached up with his uninjured hand and gently touched her swollen lip. "I should have killed them," he said quietly. "No," Nora whispered. "No more death." She finished bandaging his arm. She looked at him, standing between his knees. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve. "You came for me," she said. "Always," Eli answered. The air in the room changed. It became heavy, thick with the realization that they had almost lost everything. The fear of death is a powerful aphrodisiac, stripping away the trivial and leaving only the essential truth. We are here, we are alive, and we are together. Nora dropped the bloody cloth into the basin. She did not step back. "Eli," she said, her voice steady now, "I do not want to be afraid anymore." She reached for his hand, the good one, and placed it against her heart. He could feel it beating, strong and fast. "I am freely giving," she whispered. Eli stood up. He looked at her with a fierce, possessive love. He did not ask again. He swept her up into his arms, ignoring the pain in his ribs, and carried her into the bedroom. The door kicked shut behind them. There was no hesitation this time. The clothes were shed with frantic hands, barriers of wool and cotton falling away to reveal skin that hungered for contact. When they finally lay together under the heavy quilts, it was not just an act of pleasure. It was a reclaiming. Nora traced the scars on his chest with her lips. Eli worshipped the softness of her skin with his hands. They moved together with a desperate, rhythmic urgency, trying to merge into a single entity that the world could not hurt. When Eli entered her, Nora cried out, not in pain, but in a sudden, overwhelming release. The shame she had carried for years, the belief that she was dirty, that she was used goods, it burned away in the heat of his love. He looked at her not as a conquest, but as a miracle. They clung to each other as the climax took them, a shuddering, earth-shattering wave that left them gasping, tangled together in the sheets, sweat cooling on their skin. They lay in the aftermath, the silence of the room profound. Nora rested her head on his shoulder, her hand flat on his chest. She felt clean. She felt whole. Morning came too soon. It brought with it a blinding white sun and the harsh reality of their situation. Gus came to the door at dawn. He looked grim. "Eli," he called out, "you best come see this?" Eli dressed quickly, kissing Nora on the forehead before he left the room. He went out to the porch. A deputy from town was there, sitting on a horse, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. McCrae," the deputy said. "What is it, Jim?" Eli asked, leaning against the post, favoring his bad arm. "Kincaid was at the sheriff's office this morning," the deputy said, refusing to meet Eli's eyes. "He says you attacked 3 of his employees, says you jumped them on the road and tried to kill them." Eli laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Did he mention they were assaulting Miss Bennett?" "He says that is a lie," the deputy said. "He says she lured them there. Says she is a woman of loose morals who tried to solicit them. And when they refused, you jumped them to rob them." Eli's hands clenched into fists. "That is a lie, Jim. And you know it." The deputy shrugged. "I know Kincaid owns the judge. And the sheriff? There is talk of a warrant, Eli, for attempted murder." He turned his horse. "I suggest you get your affairs in order." Eli watched him ride away. He turned back to the house. Nora was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. She had heard everything. "They are going to come for you," she said, her face pale. "Let them come," Eli said, walking to her. "But the town," she whispered, "they will believe him. They already think I am. They think I am a whore, Eli, and now they think you are a madman." Eli took her face in his hands. "It does not matter what they think," he said. "We know the truth, and I am not running. Not this time." He looked out at the frozen plains, at the storm clouds gathering again in the west. "We stand our ground. Nora, we stand our ground." The warrant arrived 2 days later, carried not by a faceless deputy, but by Sheriff Haynes himself. He rode up the lane with his hat pulled low, his eyes fixed on the pommel of his saddle as if he could not bear to look at the house. Behind him rode 2 other men, their badges glinting dull silver in the flat, gray light of a prairie noon. Eli was chopping wood by the side of the house. He did not stop when he heard the hooves. He swung the axe with a rhythmic, powerful cadence, splitting the logs cleanly, the sound echoing like a heartbeat against the silence of the snow-covered fields. Nora stood on the porch, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her hands gripped the rough railing until her knuckles turned the color of old bone. She knew what this was. Kincaid moved with the speed of a man who knew that delay was the enemy of profit. Sheriff Haynes pulled his horse up. He was a good man, or had been once, before the railroad money started flowing through the county like whiskey at a wake. "Eli," the sheriff said, his voice heavy. Eli drove the axe into the chopping block and left it there, the handle quivering. He turned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. "Sheriff," Eli said, "you are a long way from your stove. I have a paper." "Eli," Haynes said, tapping his breast pocket. "Judge issued it this morning. Assault with intent to kill, and Mr. Kincaid has filed for foreclosure. Says the bank transferred the deed yesterday." Nora stepped off the porch, the snow crunching under her boots. "That is a lie," she cried, her voice ringing out in the cold air. "It was self-defense. They attacked me." The sheriff looked at her, then back to Eli. He looked pained. "I have to take you in. Eli, Kincaid is pushing hard. He wants you in the county jail until the circuit judge gets here on Thursday." Eli looked at the handcuffs hanging from the sheriff's belt. He looked at the open range, the line of trees by the creek where he could disappear in 10 minutes if he took the bay horse. He knew the trails. He knew the caves in the foothills. He could run, but running meant admitting he was the outlaw Kincaid said he was. Running meant leaving Nora alone to face the wolves. "I am not running," Eli said quietly. He walked forward, extending his wrists. "Eli, no!" Nora rushed forward, grabbing his arm. "You cannot go with them. Kincaid will have you killed in that cell." Eli stopped. He looked down at her, his eyes fierce and tender. "If I run, they win," he said. "If I run, every lie they told about you and me becomes the truth. I will not give them that." He turned to the sheriff. "I'm coming in, Haynes, but you tell Kincaid if anything happens to this ranch, or the people on it, while I am gone. There is not a jail cell in this territory that will hold me." The sheriff nodded, stepping down to click the iron cuffs around Eli's wrists. The sound was small, metallic, and final. Nora watched through a blur of tears as they hoisted Eli onto his horse. His hands were bound in front of him. He looked back at her once, his jaw set, his gaze burning a promise into her soul. Then they turned and rode away, a dark procession moving slowly across the blinding white snow, leaving a silence behind them that felt loud enough to shatter glass. The ranch felt like a tomb without him. The days that followed were a blur of gray misery. The physical work did not stop. Cattle still needed hay. The ice still needed breaking, but the spirit had gone out of the place. Gus moved around with a limp that seemed more pronounced, his face a mask of helpless fury. He muttered constantly about railroad thieves and carpetbaggers, his hands trembling as he rolled his cigarettes. Tommy looked lost. He did his chores with a mechanical dullness, looking at the empty chair at the head of the table every night as if expecting Eli to materialize. But it was the nights that nearly broke Nora. She lay in her bed, the cold seeping through the walls, and the absence of Eli was a physical ache. She missed the heat of his body. Yes, but more than that, she missed the safety of his presence. The house creaked and groaned, and every sound sounded like Kincaid's men returning to finish what they had started. Fear gnawed at her. It whispered that she was foolish, that she was ruined, that she should pack her carpet bag and flee back east to the anonymity of the slums. But then she would remember the look on Eli's face when he stood in the ravine. She would remember the scars on his back and the gentleness of his hands. He had stayed for her. He was sitting in a freezing cell for her. On the third morning, Nora woke up with a clarity that was cold and sharp as a knife. Silence was not safety. Silence was what Kincaid counted on. He counted on her shame. He counted on the town's prejudice to keep her quiet, to keep her hiding in the ranch house while he stole everything they had. She dressed in her blue serge dress. It was worn now, patched at the elbow, but she brushed it until it looked respectable. She pulled her hair back severely, pinning it tight. "Gus," she said, walking into the kitchen where the old man was staring into his coffee. "Hitch the wagon." Gus looked up. "You cannot go to town. Miss Nora, it is not safe." "I am going to town," she said, pulling on her gloves. "And I am not going to hide." She rode into Willow Creek with her head high, though her stomach was churning with nausea. She did not go to the jail. She went to the parsonage. Pastor Whitfield opened the door, a napkin tucked into his collar, startled to see the fallen woman on his step. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice dripping with icy disapproval. "I hardly think. I am not here to ask for charity." "Pastor," Nora said, pushing past him into the parlor. "I am here to offer a testimony." "Mrs." Whitfield was sitting by the fire, needlepoint in hand. She froze as Nora entered. Nora stood in the center of the room. She did not lower her eyes. "You have spoken about me from your pulpit," Nora said, her voice trembling but clear. "You have called me a danger to this town. You have let Mr. Kincaid spread lies about a man who has done nothing but work this land honestly for 10 years. We know your history." "Miss Bennett," the pastor blustered. "The saloon—" "Yes," Nora cut him off. "The saloon. Let us talk about the saloon." She took a step closer. "I sang in saloons. Pastor, I sang because my sister burned to death in a tenement fire and I had no money for a grave. I sang because the only work for a woman alone in the city is often the kind that kills her soul. Men thought my body was part of the price of a drink. They thought they could buy me. I survived. I fought them off. Night after night. I saved every penny to come here, to teach your children, to be decent." She looked at Mrs. "Whitfield, I survived," Nora repeated. "That does not make me a liar, and it does not make me a whore. It makes me strong." "And the man sitting in your jail?" He saved me from men who were sent by Silas Kincaid to rape me in a ravine. Men who work for the railroad you are all so eager to welcome." The room was silent. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly. Mrs. Whitfield lowered her needlepoint. She looked at Nora, really looked at her, and for the first time, the judgment in her eyes wavered. She saw the worn dress, the raw hands, the fierce, desperate dignity. "Is this true?" Mrs. Whitfield asked softly. "About the men in the ravine?" Nora held her gaze. "As God is my witness." Nora did not stop at the parsonage. She went to the dry goods store. She went to the blacksmith. She spoke to the women she met on the boardwalk. She did not shout, and she did not beg. She simply told the truth. She laid her shame out in the open, exposing the scars of her past, and in doing so, she took away the power Kincaid held over her. It was humiliating, to see the shock on their faces, to say the words aloud, but it was also liberating. The secret was out. Kincaid could not blackmail her with what she had already confessed. By evening, the mood in Willow Creek had shifted. It was not a tidal wave, but it was a ripple. Women who knew the fear of men's tempers looked at her with a new, quiet understanding. Men who had borrowed money from Kincaid and felt the squeeze of his rates began to wonder if the polished gentleman was quite as honest as his suit implied. The day of the hearing dawned with a sky the color of a bruise. The county courthouse was a small, stifling box of a building. The wood stove in the corner was overheating, making the air thick with the smell of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and stale tobacco. Every bench was packed. The town had turned out for the spectacle. Kincaid sat at the plaintiff's table. He looked pristine. His suit was brushed, his hair oiled, his demeanor that of a long-suffering businessman dealing with savages. He whispered to his lawyer, a sharp-faced man from Denver, and smiled confidently at the judge. Eli was brought in through the side door. Nora's breath hitched when she saw him. He was still in the clothes he had been arrested in. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, and the stubble on his jaw had grown into a beard. But he stood straight. He did not slouch like a criminal. He scanned the room until he found Nora in the front row. He didn't smile, but his eyes locked onto hers, drawing strength from her presence. The judge, a heavy man named Miller with a face like a bulldog, banged his gavel. "This court is in session," Miller grunted. "We are here to hear the matter of the territory versus Eli McCrae in the petition for foreclosure brought by Mr. Silas Kincaid." The proceedings were brutal from the start. Kincaid's lawyer painted a picture of Eli as a violent, unstable drifter with a mysterious past who had brutally attacked 3 honest railroad employees. He produced the foreclosure papers, claiming Eli was destitute and refusing to pay his debts. Then they called Nora to the stand. She walked to the witness chair, conscious of every eye on her. Kincaid watched her with a smug, oily smile, expecting her to crumble. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" the bailiff mumbled. "I do," Nora said. Eli's lawyer, a court-appointed man who looked like he would rather be fishing, asked her to describe the events of the assault. Nora took a deep breath. She looked at the jury, 6 local men, ranchers and shopkeepers. "I was riding back from town." She began. Her voice was low, but it carried in the silence. "I was in the Devil's Cut. 3 men blocked the way. They pulled me from my horse." She detailed the attack. She did not use graphic words, but she described the fear, the cold ground, the smell of whiskey on the leader's breath. She described how they laughed when she begged them to stop. "Mr. McCrae saved my life," she said, looking at Eli. "He did not attack them for money. He attacked them because they were hurting me." Kincaid's lawyer stood up. "Miss Bennett," he sneered, "is it not true that you were formerly employed at the Gilded Cage Saloon in St. Louis? As a singer?" "Yes," Nora said steadily. "And is it not true that you are currently cohabiting with the defendant? Unmarried?" "Objection," Eli's lawyer said half-heartedly. "I am answering," Nora said, cutting him off. "Yes, I live at the ranch. I work there. And yes, I love him." A gasp ran through the room. "But that does not change what those men did," Nora said, her voice rising. "And it does not change the fact that Mr. Kincaid hired them." Kincaid's lawyer dismissed her, looking pleased with himself, thinking he had discredited her character. But he had misjudged the room. He had expected the town to be scandalized by her confession. Instead, they were uncomfortable. They saw a woman defending her life, not a seductress. Then, against all advice, Eli stood up. "I want to speak," he said. The judge frowned. "You do not have to." "Son, I want to." Eli walked to the stand. He sat down, the wood creaking under his weight. "Mr. Kincaid says I am a criminal," Eli said, his voice rough gravel. "He says I am a danger. Well, I am going to tell you the truth." He looked at Kincaid. "I rode with the Red River Gang in '65. I was young, angry, and stupid. We stole cattle. We raided farms. The crowd murmured." Kincaid looked triumphant. This was the confession he wanted. "But I left," Eli continued. "I left the night Silas Kincaid ordered the shooting of a 17-year-old boy during a raid near the border." Kincaid's smile vanished. He sat up straight. That boy had a shotgun. Eli said to the jury, "He was defending his home." Kincaid laughed when he died. "I walked away that night. I came here. I worked every acre of my land with my own hands. I paid for every cow. I have lived clean for 10 years trying to make up for the sins of my youth." He leaned forward, gripping the rail of the witness box. "I will not lie to keep what I have got. I am an outlaw, by the letter of the law. But I will not let a man like Kincaid take my home with lies. Neither. He sent those men. He bought the banknote to squeeze me out because the railroad wants the water rights. He is not a businessman. He is a thief in a silk suit." "Lies!" Kincaid shouted, jumping up. "This man is a murderer and a liar!" The courtroom erupted into shouting. The judge banged his gavel furiously. "Order! Order! In the chaos!" Eli's lawyer whispered something to the judge. The judge pointed to the back of the room. "I want to hear from the men who were attacked," he shouted. "One of Kincaid's hired men, the one with the broken arm and a sling, was sitting in the back row." He looked pale. He had been listening to the murmurs of the townspeople. He saw the way the sheriff was looking at Kincaid. He realized the wind was changing. He stood up slowly. "Your Honor," the man said, his voice shaking. "State your name," the judge barked. "Billings, sir, Mr. Billings. Did Eli McCrae attack you unprovoked?" Billings looked at Kincaid. Kincaid's eyes were murderous, promising retribution. Then he looked at Eli, who sat calm and stoic. He looked at Nora, who watched him with a pleading intensity. Billings looked at the floor. "No, sir," he mumbled. "Speak up." "No, sir," Billings said louder. We were sent to scare the woman. Mr. Kincaid said to make sure she knew her place, to push her a little. McCrae, he just jumped us." The courtroom exploded. This time, the gavel could not stop it. "Perjury!" Kincaid screamed. "He has been bought." The judge stood up, his face red. "Sheriff, detain Mr. Kincaid." Kincaid looked around. He saw the anger in the faces of the farmers and ranchers. He saw the trap closing. He did not wait for the handcuffs. He grabbed the heavy leather satchel on the table, the one containing the deeds, the foreclosure papers, and the forged railroad contracts. And he ran. He shoved his own lawyer aside and bolted for the side door. "Stop him!" the sheriff shouted. Eli did not wait for the sheriff. He leaped over the railing of the witness box. He barreled through the crowd, shoving aside the bailiff who tried to grab him. He burst out the side door into the blinding sunlight of the street. Kincaid was scrambling onto his horse. The satchel clutched to his chest. He saw Eli coming and panicked. He fumbled inside his coat. He drew a small, nickel-plated revolver. "Eli!" Nora screamed. Running out the door behind him, Kincaid fired. The shot went wild, kicking up dirt at Eli's feet. Eli did not stop. He lunged for the horse's bridle. Kincaid kicked the horse, wheeling it around. The animal reared, terrified by the shouting and the gunshot. Kincaid fired again. This time, the bullet found a mark. Gus, who had been waiting by the wagon with the team, had run into the street when the commotion started. He grunted, spinning around as the bullet took him in the shoulder. He fell to the dusty ground. "Gus!" Eli roared. The street turned into chaos. People were diving for cover behind water troughs and barrels. Kincaid tried to spur the horse, but the satchel slipped from his grip. It hit the ground, the clasp bursting open. Papers, hundreds of them, exploded into the air. Caught by the relentless prairie wind, Kincaid looked down at the papers. His leverage, his power, scattering like dirty snow. He raised the gun toward Eli, his face twisted in a rictus of hate. "Drop it!" Sheriff Haynes shouted, stepping out of the courthouse, his rifle raised. Kincaid swung the pistol toward the sheriff. Haynes fired. The crack of the rifle was deafening. Kincaid jerked back as if pulled by a rope. The bullet shattered his upper arm. He dropped the pistol and tumbled from the saddle, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. Silence slammed back down on the street. The wind whistled. Carrying the papers down the street, a deed fluttered past Nora's feet. She looked down. It was a foreclosure notice for the Miller Ranch, dated 3 weeks prior to the actual loan default. A forgery. Eli stood in the middle of the street, chest heaving. He looked at Kincaid, who was writhing in the dust, clutching his shattered arm. Then he ran to Gus. Nora was already there, pressing her shawl against Gus's shoulder. "Is he?" Eli gasped, dropping to his knees. "I am fine," Gus wheezed, his face gray. "Just a scratch. Eli, just a damn scratch. But I think you got him." Eli looked up. The townspeople were creeping out from cover. They were picking up the papers. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, picked up a sheet of paper. His face went white. This is a transfer of water rights," he stammered. "It is signed by me." "But I never signed this." Another rancher held up a document. "This says he owns my south pasture. I never sold it." The realization rippled through the crowd. The awe of Kincaid's wealth, the fear of his influence, evaporated, replaced by the cold anger of people who realized they had been played. Sheriff Haynes walked over to Kincaid. He kicked the pistol away. "Get the doc." Haynes ordered a bystander. "Then get a rope. We are going to tie this son of a bitch to the jail bed until the marshal gets here." He looked at Eli. "You are free to go." "Eli, I think we have seen enough." Eli did not answer. He looked at Nora. She was kneeling in the bloody dust, her hands pressed to Gus's wound, her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked up at him. There was blood on her dress, dust on her face, and tears in her eyes. But she was smiling. A small, trembling, exhausted smile. "It is over," she whispered. Eli reached out and took her hand, his bloody fingers interlacing with hers. The wind blew, scattering the lies of Silas Kincaid across the prairie, leaving only the truth standing in the muddy street. The departure of Silas Kincaid from Willow Creek was not the triumphant procession of a conquered king, but the shuffling exit of a common thief. 2 federal marshals, summoned by telegram from the capital, arrived to chain him to the seat of a buckboard wagon. He looked smaller without his fine coat, his arm in a sling, his face gray with pain and the sudden, crushing realization of his own ruin. He did not look at Eli or Nora as the wagon rolled out of town, its wheels churning the same mud he had tried to claim as his kingdom. But his departure did not magically repair the fences he had cut or refill the grain bins he had emptied. The victory, as it turned out, was heavy. The McCrae Ranch bore the scars of the winter's siege. The main house, once a fortress against the cold, now showed its wounds in the harsh light of early spring. There were burn marks on the corner beam where one of Kincaid's men had tried to set a torch before fleeing. The front door, kicked in during the raid, was patched with mismatched pine planks that stood out like a bandage on weathered skin. The corrals leaned drunkenly where posts had been sawed through. And then there was Gus. The old ranch hand survived the bullet to his shoulder, but the lead had taken something vital from him. He moved slower now, a hitch in his step that had not been there before. He could no longer lift a saddle with one hand or swing a hammer with the easy rhythm of a younger man. He spent more time on the porch, whittling and watching the horizon with eyes that had lost some of their spark. He was alive, but he was diminished, a living tally of the cost of their survival. The legal resolution was equally scarred. Eli stood before Judge Miller 3 weeks after the shootout. The courtroom was empty this time, save for the clerk and Nora, who sat in the back row, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Judge Miller adjusted his spectacles and looked down at Eli. "You put this court in a difficult position. Mr. McCrae," the judge said, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "You stopped a fraud. You likely saved this county from a predator. And the testimony of Miss Bennett regarding the ravine, well, it paints a clear picture of self-defense." He paused, shuffling papers. "However, I cannot ignore the law. You are a confessed participant in the Red River raids. You rode with outlaws. That is a matter of public record now. You cannot put that genie back in the bottle." "I'm not asking to," Eli said, standing tall. "I am done hiding." The judge nodded slowly. "Good, because if you were, I would have to put you in a cell. As it stands, considering the time elapsed and your assistance in apprehending a federal fugitive, I am sentencing you to a fine of $500, and you will be on a probationary status for 2 years. One step out of line, one brawl in a saloon, and you will serve the time for those cattle raids." $500, Eli repeated. It was a fortune. It was more money than he had seen in 3 years. "You have 6 months to pay," the judge said, banging his gavel. Case closed. They walked out of the courthouse into the blinding spring sunshine. They were free, but they were shackled by a new weight. The foreclosure was nullified. Kincaid's fraud had seen to that, but the original debts to the bank remained, compounding with interest, now added to the crushing weight of the court fine. They rode back to the ranch in silence. The relief of avoiding prison was tempered by the crushing reality of the work ahead. It was a muddy, imperfect kind of justice, the only kind the West seemed capable of offering. The town of Willow Creek did not transform overnight. There were no parades, no sudden embrace of the woman they had scorned. Prejudice, like the deep roots of the sagebrush, was hard to pull out. When Nora walked into the general store the following Tuesday, the conversation still died. Mrs. Gable still looked uncomfortable when Nora asked for credit. There were still mothers who pulled their children to the other side of the street, whispering that a court victory did not wash away the sins of a saloon singer. But there were cracks in the ice. One afternoon, a week after the trial, a buggy pulled up to the ranch. Nora was on the porch, mending a shirt, when she saw the stiff, upright figure of Mrs. Whitfield, the pastor's wife, climbing down. Nora stood up, her heart guarding itself against another attack. Mrs. Whitfield walked up the steps. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She stopped at the railing, looking at the patched door, then at Nora. "Mrs. Whitfield," Nora said, her voice neutral. "Miss Bennett," the older woman said. She seemed to struggle with the words, her mouth working silently for a moment. She thrust the basket forward. "I brought some sourdough bread and a jar of peach preserves." It is from the cellar." Nora looked at the basket, then at the woman's face. She saw the conflict there, the lifetime of rigid morality warring with the undeniable truth of courage she had witnessed in the courtroom. "Thank you," Nora said softly, taking the basket. Mrs. Whitfield smoothed her skirts. "My husband? He is a man of the book. Miss Bennett, he sees the world in black and white. But I suppose the good Lord sometimes writes in gray." She looked out at the fields. "What you did in that courtroom, speaking of your sister, and those men, it was a brave thing." "I do not know if I could have done it." She turned back to Nora, her eyes meeting hers for a brief, honest second. "We are not friends. Miss Bennett, I cannot promise you that the ladies' circle will welcome you next week, but you are a neighbor, and you are safe here." "Thank you," Nora repeated, her throat tight. "That means a great deal." Mrs. Whitfield nodded briskly, the moment of vulnerability passing as she retreated into her shell. She marched back to her buggy and drove away without looking back. It was not forgiveness. It was not acceptance. But it was a truce. And for Nora, standing on the porch with the heavy basket in her arms, it was enough. That night, The reality of their future settled over the ranch. The wind had died down, leaving a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled sugar on black velvet. Eli and Nora sat on the porch steps, wrapped together in a single heavy wool blanket against the lingering chill. Eli was smoking a cigarette, the ember glowing bright orange in the dark. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes seemed etched deeper than before. $500, he said, the number hanging in the air like smoke, plus the banknotes, plus feed for the stock we have left. We will manage, Nora said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Will we? Eli asked. He sounded rough, doubting. Nora, look at this place. It is broken. I am broken. I am a man with a criminal record and a mortgage that would choke a railroad tycoon. He turned to look at her. His face shadowed. You could go, he said softly. You are clear of Kincaid now. You could take the stage, go to San Francisco, or Denver. Start over where no one knows the name Bennett or McCrae. You could find a real school, a real life. Not this. Scratching in the dirt. Nora pulled the blanket tighter around them. She looked out at the dark shapes of the hills. I ran for a long time. Eli, she said, I ran from the fire. I ran from the saloon. I ran from the shame. I thought if I just kept moving, I would find a place where I was clean. She turned to him, reaching up to touch the rough stubble on his cheek. But I realized something in that courtroom. You do not find that place. You make it. She took his hand, his calloused fingers engulfing hers. I am scared. Eli, I am scared of the debt. I am scared the town will never truly let me be just a teacher. I am scared that the winter will come back and try to kill us again. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. But the thought of being safe somewhere else, without you, that scares me more. Eli made a sound in his throat, a low rumble of emotion. He dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. He turned his body, pulling her fully into his arms. I have nothing to give you. Nora, he rasped. Just hard work and a leaky roof. You are wrong, she said fiercely. You gave me back my life. You gave me a reason to stand up. Eli buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her, soap and wind and woman. You are my home. Nora, he whispered against her skin. Not this land, not the house, you. If the bank takes the ranch tomorrow, if the sheriff comes back, as long as you are standing there, I am home. The admission cracked the last of the distance between them, in the cold dark, under the vast indifference of the western sky. They held on to each other with a desperate, terrifying hope. They made a silent pact, sealed not with paper and ink, but with the warmth of their bodies. They would face the drought, the debt, and the gossip, but they would face it together. The spring unfolded slowly, a reluctant blooming. The work was endless. They spent days riding the fence line, repairing the damage Kincaid's men had done. Nora learned to stretch wire, her hands growing as tough and scarred as Eli's. She learned to ride the range not as a passenger, but as a partner, spotting strays and checking water holes. They diversified. It was Nora's idea. Cattle are a gamble. She said one night over beans and cornbread, if the market drops, we starve. We need something else. They used the last of their savings to buy 3 dairy cows and a flock of chickens. It was small, humble work, but it brought in coin. Nora sold eggs and butter in town. She stood behind her stall on market day, chin high, daring anyone to sneer. Few did. The quality of her butter spoke louder than the rumors. But the real victory came in the storage room. It was a small shed attached to the side of the barn, filled with rusted tools and old tack. Nora spent 2 weeks clearing it out. She scrubbed the floors with lye until the wood was white. She dragged in rough-hewn benches that Eli built from scrap lumber. She painted a piece of flat wood with lampblack to make a chalkboard. She put up a small sign, Willow Creek Day School. At first, no one came, but then Mrs. Miller, whose husband had nearly lost his ranch to Kincaid's forged papers, brought her 2 sons. They need to learn their letters. Mrs., Miller said, looking at the ground. And the town school? Well, Mrs. Dawes is harsh with the boys. Then, A few days later, a Mexican family who worked as hands on the Circle T brought their daughter. By the end of the month, Nora had 6 students. One evening, late in May, Eli came back from the pasture. He was covered in dust, exhausted to his bones. He heard singing coming from the shed. He stopped. It was not the sultry, smoky ballad of the saloon. It was a children's song, bright and simple, all things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small. Eli walked to the doorway and looked in. The room was lit by the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Nora sat on a stool in front of the children. She was wearing a simple calico dress, her hair escaping its pins. She was laughing as she led them in the verse, her hands moving in the air to mark the time. The children watched her with adoring eyes. They did not see a fallen woman. They did not see a saloon singer. They saw a teacher. Eli leaned against the doorframe, a lump forming in his throat. He remembered the night he had pulled her from the flood, shivering and broken. He remembered the way she had looked in the barn, confessing her shame. And now, she was filling this dusty shed with light. Nora looked up and saw him. Her smile faltered for a second, then widened, becoming radiant. She did not stop singing. She sang the last line, looking directly at him, her eyes shining with pride and love. The Lord God made them all. Eli tipped his hat, a silent tribute to the strongest woman he had ever known, and walked back to the house, his heart fuller than it had been in 20 years. Their life together settled into a rhythm that was as natural as the seasons. The romantic tension that had defined their early days did not vanish. It deepened. It matured into a profound, unspoken language of intimacy. After the long, grueling days, when the sun dipped below the peaks and the house went quiet, they found their refuge. They would lie in the big bed in the corner room. Eli had moved his things in weeks ago, defying the town's whispers, and simply hold each other. It was in these moments that the masks fell away completely. Nora, so fierce and guarded in public, would soften against him. She would trace the line of the bullet scar on his jaw, her fingers cool and healing. She would press her face into his chest, letting out the breath she had been holding all day. Eli, the man of stone and silence, would whisper to her. He would tell her things he had never told another soul, his fears, his regrets, the dreams he had buried when he was a young man. Their physical love was not just desire. It was an affirmation of life, in a world that was constantly trying to break them, to freeze them, to starve them. Their passion was a defiant fire. One night, after a particularly brutal week where they had lost a calf to wolves and the pump handle had snapped, their lovemaking was desperate, almost frantic. They moved together with a hunger that bordered on pain, clinging to each other as if the bed were a raft in a stormy sea. When it was over, and they lay tangled in the sheets, sweating and breathless, Eli kissed her forehead. "We are still here," he whispered. "We are still here," Nora answered, pulling his arm tighter around her waist. It was their prayer. It was their victory. June brought the heat, and with it, the unpredictable violence of the high plains weather. The day started hot and still, the air thick enough to chew. By afternoon, the sky to the west turned a bruised purple, stacking up in towering anvils of cloud. Nora was in the yard, taking the laundry down from the line. She was rushing, watching the lightning flicker in the distance. The sheets snapped in the sudden gusts of wind. She had an armful of white cotton when the sky simply opened up. It was not a gradual start. It was a deluge. The rain fell in sheets, warm and heavy, instantly soaking her to the skin. Nora shrieked, half in surprise, half in delight. The water washed away the dust, the sweat, the heat. Eli came running from the barn, a grain sack held over his head. "Nora, get inside," he shouted over the roar of the rain. He reached her, grabbing her arm to pull her toward the porch, but she stopped. She stood there in the mud, water streaming down her face, her dress plastered to her body, her hair dark and wild. She looked at him, blinking through the drops, and she began to laugh. It was a full, throaty laugh, free of fear, free of shame. Eli stopped, staring at her. He dropped the grain sack. The rain soaked him instantly. running down his neck, darkening his shirt. He looked at the woman he loved, standing in the storm, not cowering, but rejoicing. Nora grinned at him, wiping water from her eyes. "Mr. McCrae," she shouted, her voice joyous and teasing. "You are getting me all wet again." Eli stood frozen for a second. The memory of that first night, the cold, the fear, the absurdity, rushing back. But this was different. This was not a rescue. This was a life. A grin cracked his weathered face. He threw his head back and laughed, a sound that startled the horses in the corral. He stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She shrieked again, wrapping her legs around him, burying her face in his wet shoulder. "I reckon I am," he growled playfully. "And I reckon you are not melting." He spun her around in the rain, their laughter mixing with the thunder. Two fools dancing in the mud while the world washed clean around them. They collapsed onto the porch, breathless and dripping. They stood in the doorway, arm in arm, looking out at the storm. The rain hammered the thirsty earth, turning the dust to mud, filling the creek beds, promising grass for the cattle and life for the valley. Nora leaned her head against Eli's chest. She felt his heart beating, steady, strong, enduring. She knew the storm would pass. She knew there would be others. There would be droughts that cracked the earth. There would be sickness. There would be men like Kincaid who saw the world only as something to be devoured. There would be neighbors who never quite forgot the scandal. But as she watched the rain fall on the roof of the barn where she taught children to read, and looked at the fields where they had bled and fought to stay, she felt a peace she had never known in the city. She looked up at Eli. He was watching the sky, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "We have a leak in the roof," he noted dryly. "I know," Nora said, smiling. "We will fix it. Together. Together." The camera of the mind pulls back slowly. It leaves the two figures silhouetted in the doorway of the small, battered ranch house. They are wrapped around each other, a single shape against the vast, gray curtain of the rain. The house stands alone on the immense, rolling prairie, a tiny speck of warmth in a wild, unforgiving landscape. Distant thunder rolls, a low growl that fades into the sound of the falling rain. The storm is not an enemy anymore. It is just part of the land, and within that fragile shelter, a woman with a stained past and a man with scarred hands hold on to each other, to hope, and to a love that has survived both storm and fire. The screen fades to black. Thank you so much for listening to this story. You're getting me all wet. It has been a pleasure to bring Nora and Eli's journey to life for you. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and let me know where you are listening from. Did you enjoy the ending? What did you think of the justice Eli and Nora found? If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel From Wild West for more tales of romance, grit, and survival on the American frontier. Share your thoughts in English in the comments section. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.